Zionism, Islam, and the West, Chapter 8, by Kerry Bolton. Anders Breivik, Neocon. The news media has had a field day in headlining Anders Breivik's actions as those of someone from the far right, and his actions that are a consequence of rightist ideology. Yet Breivik is an avid Zionist whose motives were predicated on Islamophobia. His ideological influences are libertarian and neoconservative. He was playing his part, albeit as a loose cannon, in the clash of civilizations. Although the news media has focused on his previous membership in the Progressive Party, his ideological commitment is to Zionism. Why then did not the news media headline Breivik's atrocity as being that of a Zionist, and as a staunch supporter of Israel? As is often the case, the fictional far-right connection is a red herring. Headlines could have read Zionist extremist on shooting spree, Israel supporter massacres youngsters at labor camp in Norway, and the like. While Breivik advocates banning the Islamic religion from Europe, he seems to have totally been oblivious to the intrinsically anti-Christian nature of Orthodox Judaism, and while he wrote at length on the supposed enmity between Judeo-Christianity and Islam, he wrote nothing of the anti-Christian record of Israel, including the demolition of Christian holy sites and the common practice of spitting on Christian clergy in the Holy Land. Although he did recognize the historical predominance of Jews in leftist movements, this is an acknowledgement of the rivalry within Jewry between liberals and leftists on one side and neoconservatives on the other, the latter being considered by Breivik to be his best political allies in the fight against Islam. Breivik is a Judeophiliac to the extent that he is Islamophobic, writing in his manifesto, "Regardless of what the Jewish community's motives are, I think it's imperative that they take a stance on multiculturalism and Muslim immigration as soon as humanly possible. They have to recognize that multiculturalism is a system that allows Europe to be Islamized, and it's obviously not in their interest to contribute to this. Jews will in a much larger degree start to support this new right, just like everyone else, who oppose multiculturalism as a means to stop Islamization. At least this is my hope." In the back of their minds, they realize that a Muslim Europe will be more anti-Semitic than a Christian Europe. Muslims don't have the guilt complex that Europeans have. Many Jews feel they are trapped between the bark and the wood. They are both skeptical of Muslim immigration on the one side, and of the nationalist far right-wing movements on the other side. Nevertheless, time is of the essence, and it's imperative that the European Jewish community, without delay, take a stance on the ongoing Islamization. Neutrality on the issue is not an option. The only way of doing this is to go back to the new right wing, anti-multiculturalism, pro-Israel groups, and political parties also manifested through views such as by moderate Jewish writers such as Daniel Pipes and Bat Yeor. So what we see this guy doing here is trying to reduce religion away from God to make it about solving a sociological problem. For him, he needs to use Zionism and blend it with religion to make Judeo-Christian values instead of Christian values that are about God, to solve the Islam problem. He reduces it to a political tool, so it's not the religion. You sort of see this when Alexander Dugin calls for people to ally with pagans and Nietzscheans to stop the demonic West and forget that the Lord of this world is Satan, not just of the West, even though the West is far more demonic than Russia. Even if Putin is corrupt or whatever, he is at least having to side with religion, and the church has always had to deal with certain bad emperors and people in charge and bad bishops, but when they had to adhere to that and pretend to be Christian at least, or even if they were wrong in a heresy, eventually the church won out, and we have the saints to prove it and back it up. But this guy just reduces it the same way a lot of people want to reduce religion to a tool of expedience, and they want something that they think is stronger, like Islam, even though it's facing a massive apostasy rate in the West, so that they can solve the Zionist problem. Religion isn't a sociological reduction, nor is it a self-help thing that we've talked about with Tate. Jay Dyer has really pointed this out. He points out that God's whatever I want him to be to get what I want. So this is almost satanic in a certain way, even though Tate's not a Satanist, but it is in enforcing your thelema, your will upon the world. This is what's promised by Satan, and it makes it about us instead of about God, and it removes you from the truly religious. So these are two fundamental lies about Christianity that Alexander Schmemann talked about. Breivik's opposition to Jewish leftists, as with his opposition to liberals and leftists of any type, is no more antagonistic towards Jews per se than the opposition of Jewish neocons towards Jewish leftists. The above passage from Breivik is in total accord with the pro-Zionist neocon party line. Israel and Islam. The only right that Breivik can be said to identify with is the Zionist extreme right. This calls to mind the likes of Jewish Defense League, Likud, the Settler Movement, etc. Breivik's support for the expansion of Israeli borders north and south also reminds one of the greater Israeli empire that has always been a basis of the Zionist extreme right. He sees Israel as the vanguard in the fight against Islam, writing, "While most people refer to Israel's security fence as a wall, the fact remains that less than 5% of the barrier is actually concrete slab. The rest is a network of fence and sensors. The fence has cut terrorism incidents by more than 90% since its completion." What was the reason for establishing the security fence area? The security fence is being built with the sole purpose of saving the lives of the Israeli citizens who continue to be targeted by the terrorist campaign that began in 2000. His justification for the security wall is the same party line as that of the other pro-Zionists, including the neocon ideologues. The main difference is that Breivik is happy to call this situation apartheid, while the neocons recoil at the word. Was Breivik inspired in his shooting rampage of Norwegian youths more by the example of the Israeli security forces than by the Crusader Knights whose legacy he claimed to be reviving, albeit only with a handful of members who included 2 atheists and an agnostic, by his own account? Clash of Civilizations. Breivik is a product of the clash of civilizations formulated by neocon ideologues and used by American and Zionist interests to philosophically justify the so-called war on terrorism. He is the product of a legacy that is anything but conservative in the Western historical sense. He sees himself as an underground resistance fighter against the Islamic occupation of Europe, who in other circumstances would be honored as a war hero. He sees Islamic laws and customs taking the place of Western laws. The attitude is no different than that of Sarkozy's attempts to ban the burqa in public. Breivik writing, "Several recent incidents have demonstrated that Muslims are now trying to apply these dhimmi rules to the entire Western world. The most important one of the burning of the churches and the embassies triggered by the Danish cartoons depicted by Muhammad. This was, down to the last comma, exactly the way Muslims would treat the persecuted non-Muslims in their own countries. The cartoon jihad indicated that Muslims now felt strong enough to apply Sharia rules to Denmark, and by extension NATO. The Muhammad cartoon saga was symptomatic of the clash of civilizations. The cartoons published in Denmark were a contrived provocation against Muslims in order to create a climate of tension. It is such a strategy of tension that Breivik sought in a more dramatic way. The American neocon magazine, Human Events, which bylines itself as a leading conservative media since 1944, was among the Western media that republished the cartoons. It is of added interest that one of those instrumental in the 2006 Muhammad cartoon provocation was Daniel Pipes, cited as one of Breivik's ideological gurus, whom he calls a moderate Jewish writer, along with Bat Yeor. Christopher Bolton, writing for American Free Press, stated of this, "The anti-Muslim cartoon scandal had turned out to be a major step forward for the Zionist neocons and their long-planned clash of civilizations, the artificially constructed conflict designed to put the so-called Christian West against the Islamic world." Now, I wouldn't put it past some of these people to try to put this stuff over the edge and engage in controlled dialectics and cause these problems. But there is actually 2 civilizations that are odds, and if you put people into this very pressure cooker for this purpose that was elucidated in the last chapter, stuff like this will happen. And the conflict is bound to happen because Islamism will not accept the Western world. We are at odds with each other, and they will put us into dhimmitude. Reading continues. Bolin wrote that Fleming Rose, the cultural editor, who commissioned the cartoons for his newspaper Jyllands Posten, visited the Philadelphia office of Daniel Pipes' website, Middle East Forum, in 2004. Rose then penned a sympathetic article about Pipes entitled "The Threat from Islamism" that promoted his extreme anti-Islamic views without mentioning the fact that Pipes is a rabid Zionist extremist. Bolin cited references by the individual whom Breivik recommends as a moderate Jewish writer, Pipes having written that a change of heart of the Palestinians can only be achieved by their being utterly defeated. After 3 days of Muslim rioting in Denmark's USA CNN TV network turned to Pipes as their pundit in the situation, who then blamed Islamic extremists. At the same time, neocon U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice condemned the Syrian and Iranian governments for protests in those states. Pipes appealed to Western liberal secular values in regard to the tumult that was sparked by his Danish comrade. Will the West stand up for its customs and mores, including freedom of speech? Or will Muslims impose their way of life on the West? Ultimately, there is no compromise. Westerners will either retain their civilization, including the right to insult and blaspheme, or not. This is the Breivik line that he learned at the metaphorical knees of his neocon and Zionist gurus. Pipes at the time sided in support another of Breivik's ideological heroes, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, which is part of the network of neocon luminary David Horowitz. Pipes wrote, Robert Spencer rightly called on the free world to stand resolutely with Denmark. The informative Brussels Journal asserts, we are all Danes now. Now, Pipes states of Breivik that authors and artists such as himself cannot be held responsible for the actions of those they inspire, and like Robert Spencer and other neocons, he reiterates what seems to be their party line on the matter by giving the examples, among others, of how the Beatles helter-skelter influenced Charles Manson. However, the connection is just not that cryptic. The neocon coteries, including Daniel Pipes, have been promoting the clash of civilizations, and when a foot soldier goes rogue and gets out of control, they protest. Don't blame me. Pipes is more than a street corner agitator. He is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University, with columns appearing in newspapers around the world. He has lectured at the U.S. Naval War College, Harvard, and others, and appears to be on leading TV networks. His Middle East forum has a budget of $4 million. In a 2010 interview with the Washington Post, Pipes stated he is no longer regularly criticized as Islamophobic because of the proliferation of more extreme Islamophobes. This means that Pipes and others such as Spencer and Horowitz now look moderate because of the shifting of the center of Islamophobic gravity by years of propaganda. The interview also mentions a particularly interesting phenomenon, the support Pipes had given to the Dutch right-wing politicians Geert Wilders, who like Breivik wants to ban the Quran in the Netherlands. While regarding the new crop of bloggers as unsophisticated, a Washington Post interview states, Pipes says he shares the same enemies with people like Wilders and the new crop of bloggers. We're in the same trench, but we have different views of what the problem is. We both see an attempt to impose Islamic Sharia law in the West. We are both against it and want to maintain Western civilization, but we understand the nature of the problem differently. Important distinction, in your eyes. It is just this type of alliance between the neocons, Zionists, and the European so-called right wing that Breivik regards as a basis for the anti-Islamic civil war he hoped to foment in Europe. It is not an isolated phenomenon. The well-publicized English Defense League's anti-Muslim demonstrations and riots are marked by the number of Israeli flags appearing amidst their shaven-headed ranks. Breivik regards the EDL as one of the better organizations, writing, the British EDL seems to be the first youth organization that has finally understood this. Sure, in the beginning it was the occasional eggheads who shouted racist slogans and did Nazi salutes, but these individuals were kicked out. An organization such as the EDL has the moral high ground and can easily justify their political standpoints as they publicly oppose racism and authoritarianism. According to the anti-Zionist former Israeli Gilad Atzmon, the EDL has formed a Jewish division, which the London Jewish Chronicle states immediately drew hundreds of followers. The division is led by Roberta Moore, who was interviewed by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz and boasted about how the Jews were exploiting the EDL. Roberta Moore, age 39, the leader of the Jewish division, admitted this week to Haaretz that this is actually the Jewish division that exploits the EDL. In an interview with the Israeli newspaper on 13 July 2010, she said, they, the EDL, think the League is exploiting us. While it is really we who initiated the Jewish division. If anything, we are exploiting them. Of the previously mentioned Bat Yor, a Jewish woman of Egyptian birth, resident in Britain, she specializes in writing of the Jewish experiences in Muslim states. Her theme of Eurabia is a condemnation of relations between Europe and the Arab states. It is a concept that was taken up by Breivik. Yor contains that Eurabia is a development of Nazi and fascist origins in alliance with radical Arabs that has placed European states in a foreign policy position inimical of the interests of both Israel and the USA. In other words, it is indicative of Europe as a new force rather than as a lackey to the USA. This Eurabia was formalized in 1974 in Paris in an association called the Euro-Arab Dialogue. Yor has outlined her views in many articles, one of which was published in the Neocon National Review. She has attracted the support of neocons such as Robert Spencer. From a Western cultural perspective, the concept of Eurabia is so abhorred to Yor and other neocons, plutocrats, and Zionists is hopeful. The relationship souring the Arab states and the West are of intrusive origin and could be addressed diplomatically. The origins of poisoned relations between the West and the Arabs will now be considered. Now, readers note, I'm going to talk about, I've read her Eurabia. I've also read Mark Curtis's Secret Affairs, which Jay Dyer recommended to me, and also looked at the way he's looked at this stuff at the big picture, and he's also read this book too and is aware of these facts. So I do agree. I had the critique when I was critical of her when I was reading her as totally missing the Zionist angle of this and being completely neoconservative and just thinking the only problem was that anti-Semitism was spreading. And she was a total neocon. But Mark Curtis also backs up a lot of what she says from a completely different angle about Europe's relationships with the Muslims. And the Nazis did ally with the Muslims. We see these Nazis that are allied with the Zionists too, that nobody wants to talk about. I'm not denying that. That's why I'm reading this book right here. But you do see this kind of desire for a warrior religion, and there was a greater alliance, like we talked about before, between the fascists and the Islamists. You had a lot of people that ran away to the Islamic countries when the Nazis fell. Nazis stayed down there. Nazis worked both sides of the Cold War. You have the infamous Skorzeny. He's not the only one, but he's probably the biggest one to point to. And Bat Yor did live in Egypt and had to flee Egypt because it was really bad there with the Muslims, and her family was brutalized by Muslims, and she saw this shit. We have an apologist, Jim Apologetics. He's from the Middle East. He knows about this stuff. He talks about the Dimitude. He's not making this shit up. He's not a neocon. He's anti-Zionist. But he also sees where you can go too far with this. And these Muslims, Sam Shamoun knows about this. We have people, I watched a girl on Twitter, Black Ortho GF, she's from Egypt, where Coptic women are kidnapped and raped by these Muslims because they're just dhimmis. To sit here and say that there's no reason to be concerned whatsoever about these Muslims coming in just because fucking Kerry Bolton thinks they'll help us against the Jews, you're just trading one thing for the other. And there's this desire to syncretize this type of warrior religion together. And you have the Nazi International in here, and you have people that played both sides. Skorzeny worked for Israel and worked for Russia and worked for the Muslims, all at the same time. To think that this isn't something to be concerned with at all, or this Eurabia premise is completely wrong, isn't the right way to go about this. The right way to go about this would to be look at both the problems of Zionism and the elites that are allied with them that Kerry Bolton already talked about, as well as looking at this Eurabia premise and cutting out the neoconservatism and putting it in a stronger philosophical and theological lens and a totally coherent worldview, all the way up to what presupposes us, all the way down to the specifics in the politics and the ethnos of different people. Continued. Souring of Arab and Western relations. Israel has existed for much of its history since 1948 by maintaining the fiction that is the only reliable state in the Middle East that is Western-oriented amidst a sea of states hostile to Western values. The dichotomy is misleading. Israel was for the first years of its existence largely a center of Marxist agitation in the Middle East. And even before the declaration of Israel in 1948, Zionist settlers in Palestine were conveyors of the Marxist creed that has never found fertile ground in any form among the Arabs. Israel is neither pro-Western nor anti-Western. It is pro-Israel, no more and no less. Israel has always played a duplicitous game diplomatically. For example, it has for decades maintained a largely covert relationship with Red China to the point of contravening U.S. restrictions on weapons transfers. As for the souring of relations between the West and the Arabs, this is of a particularly treacherous nature and is a festering sore that the West has had the responsibility to heal. As we have seen, the origins of this perfidy are in the World War I at the time when the Arabs were under Ottoman rule, fighting for the Entente with promises of independence, while the Zionists had connived to do a backroom deal with the British War Cabinet. And that's true. There's another side of this too with the Fabians, though, that were pro-T.E. Lawrence and trying to Islamize Europe at that time to break Christianity. And the people will call us Christ cucks, but these people will cuck their own culture just to have a solution to a worldly problem and to be somebody new in these movements with something that they can bootstrap into their own needs. Target, The background of Western duplicity towards the Arabs, along with the Zionist wire pulling, is directly relevant to the present clash of civilizations. The war on terrorism and the Breivik atrocity is a manifestation of these. Leading up to the Breivik massacre of the Labour Party youth, the neocons had been agitating against the Labour government that was indicting it would adopt a more strident policy towards Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. In particular, the youth wing of the party was lobbying for a Norwegian economic boycott of Israel. Joseph Klein, posting on Haaretz's front page mag 2 days before Breivik's rampage, described the Norwegian government as Quislings and called them the latest example of Norwegian collaboration with the enemies of the Jews. Is the language any less inflammatory than Breivik's European Declaration of Independence that the news media and their pundits are scrutinizing for signs of right-wing extremism? Klein stated, Norwegian Foreign Minister Jonas Gahr Støre declared during a press conference this week alongside Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas that Norway believes it is perfectly legitimate for the Palestinian president to turn to the United Nations to seek recognition of an independent Palestinian state. An agreement was signed giving Palestine's representative in Norway full ambassadorial status. Støre also appealed for financial help for Palestinians. Other transgressions by the Norwegians, according to Klein, include a Labour member of parliament stating that Jews exaggerate the Holocaust, socialist leader Christian Halvorsen, with having participated in an anti-Israel demonstration while serving as Minister of Finance, the Norwegian government's divesting of funds from 2 Israeli companies in 2010, the claim that anti-Semitism is alive and well among the Norwegian political, cultural, and academic elite, pro-Hitler sentiments expressed by Muslim students in Norway, and more. Klein stated that part of the reason for this rise in anti-Semitism is because of the toleration of multiculturalism by the Norwegian establishment. He ends by writing, Norway is repeating its quisling treachery of the Nazi era, this time in league with a growing radical Muslim population, and once again the Jews are the victims. A Hebrew website, Rodder, states that 2 days before the massacre, the leader of the Norwegian Labour Party, Eskil Petersen, said in an interview that it was time to end dialogue with Israel and undertake tough measures, including an economic boycott by Norway. The youth at the Labour camp aimed to lobby their party for a boycott. The site describes the Labour youth camp. 48 hours before the shooting attack on the island, the youth met at the Norwegian foreign minister. Some called for a boycott of Israel. On Wednesday, the second day of the ruling party youth conference on the island, the youth holiday camp discussed with the Norwegian foreign minister Jonas Gahr Støre and ordered him to support Palestine. About 48 hours later, many of them were killed. Anders Behring Breivik launched a mass shooting. Labor youth movement demanded recognition of a Palestinian state, and foreign minister have said that the Palestinians get their own state. The occupation must end. The wall should be demolished, and it has to happen now, said Gahr Støre to the audience. Some of the youngsters in the camp, waving a placard with the word boycott Israel, demanded an economic embargo on Israel. Summer camp ended in a massacre. Leader Eskil Petersen said that young people require imposition of an economic embargo on Israel. Our policy in the Middle East is to be more active and demand recognition of Palestine. There is also the peace process back on track, said Petersen. The foreign minister agreed with him, but said that the boycott is not the right approach. This will make dialogue become a monologue. The media pundits have waxed indignant about the extremists who have posted on the far-right websites in support of Breivik's actions. Dr. Matthew Goodwin, writing for The Telegraph, quote, make no mistake, Breivik has already become a heroic figure for sections of the ultra-far right, much in the same way Timothy McVeigh became a hero for sections of the militia movement in the United States. In Britain, his anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and anti-establishment ideas are easily found in a far-right scene that has become fragmented and chaotic. Yet it does not seem to have been pointed out that Breivik's action has generated enthusiasm in Israel. Some of the posts on the Israel Hebrew website Reuters state, because I waited with this response until after it became clear that there was indeed a conference which explicitly called for the boycott of Israel, I am very happy and pleased about the massacre that took place in the camp of the enemies of Israel. Next, Hitler Youth members killed in the bombing of Germany were also innocent. Let us all cry out the terrible and evil bombardment carried out by the Allies. We have a bunch of haters of Israel meeting in a country that hates Israel in a conference that endorses the boycott. So it's not okay, not nice, really a tragedy for families. And we condemn the act itself, but to cry about it? Come on. We are Jews, not Christians. We are Jews, not Christians. No humanity there. There's something demonic there. In the Jewish religion, there is no obligation to love or mourn for the enemy. It's almost like they have to take that even further, though, and invert the Christian ideals and to hate even innocent people and turn innocent people into enemies. And you're seeing this with desensitization across our entire society. Everybody will suddenly, somebody get innocent people killed in Gaza. It's okay. It's good. They voted for Hamas supposedly. Well, you know, that logic could be turned around on you for voting for Trump or not wanting to get vaccinated, right? Then other people, when Israelis are killed, well, they deserve it because they're Jews, even if they're innocent little kids too, which is happening. And Hamas isn't just like over there fucking, you know, sniffing roses and handing out candy because they show you a video where they were nice to somebody. And you see Republicans will get like this when something happens with somebody who's a left wing. Somebody on the right gets hurt and they want us to die. People want to stab us in the face over COVID. Something bad happens to somebody. A bunch of people come online and cheer for it. I see people excuse, you know, a white kid getting stomped on by 20 black people. It's just, as soon as somebody is an enemy, they're completely dehumanized, but we're not even fighters. It's a bunch of people behind their fucking computer screens, depersonalizing everybody, wanting them to die. It's very demonic, and you can see this here. But it seems very, I'm sure it's worse too in a war zone. Two people living next to each other who are always fighting, hate each other. And we did this when I was in the military. We dehumanized the enemy. We stopped thinking of them as humans because then it would be harder to kill them. But there's something really wrong with this, and with a lot of these TikToks being made and stuff, it's disgusting. Continued. It's stupidity and malice not to want the death of those who call to boycott Israel. To boycott Israel. You got the right to fucking kill us over here? If I don't want to pay for your fucking country and drag myself into war, to world war, and have my daughters drafted into it and put into austerity like good Goyim, fuck you. Next, I have no sympathy for those who want the destruction of Israel. Not looking for excuses, but it's for not our mourning. Like not mourning at the time that 50,000 dead in the bombing of Dresden. May all of our enemies be paid with such speed. All of our enemies, these kids. At least now they have more important things to worry about than Israel. Maybe we can arrange a badge of honor on behalf of the international headquarters of saving people and the land. It seems that Breivik's actions made a lot of sense from a pro-Zionist perspective. But the motives have nothing to do with the ideologies of the far right, and much more to do with supporting Israel. Conclusion. The clash of civilizations now taking place in the name of the war on terrorism is a second Cold War foisted upon the world in order to achieve American global hegemony and Zionist aggrandizement. With the eclipse of the First Cold War following the implosion of the Soviet bloc, the USA required another world boogeyman to justify its global adventures. The same ideologues undertook a new Cold War, this time against Islam, using the same type of sloganeering. Islamophobia is the new anti-Sovietism and is serving the same interests. Trotskyites and other Marxists disaffected by the rise of Stalin created the ideological foundation for the Cold War. That is where the so-called neoconservative movement had its origins. And that's also what William Buckley went in there with these Trotskyites. He was a CIA operative. He was fucking knighted. He was knighted by a bunch of Fabian socialists. He set the Overton window on firing line with Noam Chomsky, who had tons of trips to Epstein Island. And they would dictate what the intellectual currents were and what the conversation was. Irving Kristol, they bumped out Russell Kirk. You know, and here's the thing. I remember seeing some of this before I even knew it, before I even really went all the way down. And like, I'm not a libertarian, but I read a lot of their literature. Before I went down the rabbit hole and looked at the problems of the right or into any of this conspiracy stuff, long before that, I started getting into politics probably a little over 10 years ago and reading real history. And I started to notice, you know, some holes in the game. And it wasn't even reading this stuff. It was reading conservative literature. I read Thomas Sowell. I got really into Thomas Sowell, and then I was like, came back like all naive. Hey guys, look what I learned. I learned some stuff here that could help us to win. And it was like people would get mad about what the conservatives pretending to be when you put forward the actual facts that were devastating to the left. A lot of the times they didn't want anything besides a Thomas Sowell meme or something that pertained to what was going on in the news. But if you actually got deeper into it, to the real actual, free market economics and stuff, and it conflicted with this neoconservatism that pretends to be about the free markets, people would get really mad. And I could tell and see, I started to see the hypocrisy and the lies in the people like, Mark Levin, Shapiro. They're full of fucking shit. They're so full of shit. And then when I went and looked a little bit more into this, I didn't buy into the libertarian stuff. It's insane and stupid to try to reduce man to property rights. And then for ultimate freedom, you reduce man to property rights, and then children have no rights and can be sold as sex slaves in Rothbard and shit. And the idiot thinks he thinks like it's all a math problem. Oh, so what if you get rid of the state and a new one comes in? If you get a new state, you're just right back where you were. Well, you could get a worse state. You could get a lot of people fucking killed in the meantime, right? Oh, you're just right back where you were. So what? Yeah, maybe you should think about it a little bit more. It's almost like autistic, and he just reads through everything in philosophy. I'm not a proponent of Nietzsche, but you see, it's like he speed reads through Nietzsche, then finds one paragraph where Nietzsche criticizes the state as the new idol. The state. Here's the big guns, and he just goes through everybody and gets a quote against the state, and everything's going to be some perfect libertarian paradise. Is a different type of natural state fallacy. We was all libertarians and shit. All right, let's continue with these neocons. Anti-Soviet rhetoric has been altered to apply the new menace of radical Islam. The slogan now is Islamofascism, coined by neocon ideologue Stephen Schwartz, director of the Center of Islamic Pluralism. Schwartz's background, like many of the neocon founders, is as a Trotskyite, and he reiterated to National Review that he would defend the legacy of Trotsky to his last breath. Yeah, I remember learning about this after I got into that, and it's like, wow, these people are a bunch of scumbags. And an interesting thing here, too, with these Trotskyites who were backed by Wall Street as much as they were the Zionists. These people, Kerry Bolton already talked about the Zionists lied to. These people were the ones that backed communism. They funded the fucking communism to attack the church and to attack nationalism and monarchy. And you start to see this. We're riding off the coattails of Christianity, even though we had this Freemasonry and this capitalism. We still had a little more Christianity here, and a little bit more of a kind of like Burke had this more hesitant disposition in America, and they were a little bit more honest. But there was still real radical stuff like the French Revolution with Thomas Paine and people like that. But in the French Revolution, they funded all this stuff back then to get rid of monarchy and to make the money power the thing. This is where this idea that we all worship the same God when we don't. The referent is not the same just because of the word. We don't. The Abrahamic religions are very clear that we don't just believe that God's whatever any of us think it is. We think of an agentic God that reveals himself to us. So to say he was incapable of doing that, and that we all just believe in the same God, but we all got it a little bit different, negates the entire premise. So you might as well not believe in anything. And we started pushing that to make the money more important, about liberalism and comfort and everybody doing business, because then the Arab and the Jew and the Christian can do business. And some of those people who wanted to take out the church and have the mercantile class, this isn't just the Jews, but also the Jews had an interest in that, right? And having Christianity diluted, there was alliance there. It starts before the Jews too, with the monarchists. And this is one of the things, I'm pro-monarchy in theory, but that can still be corrupted. You had kings that wanted to break free from the Catholic Church. As much as we argue with the Catholic Church as Orthodox, you see this breakaway start to happen in positions of Western Christian power, people making their own moves for themselves. But then the Jews start to ally with that, and there's a lot of funding of Calvin in Geneva, which is like a capital of capitalism. So this is where this idea that we all worship the same God. So then apologetics come off the table. You also get the Kantian turn, and everything becomes subject. We get rid of metaphysics. So now we're not even supposed to do apologetics and argue about which one's right. We have all this access to information. We can actually eliminate a lot of superfluous positions. Even if you were to talk about within Christianity, we can get rid of a lot of bullshit Christianity if we were to really have these debates, which is why we do not have them, right? Because we could narrow it down a lot. We could get rid of Christian Zionism. If you start to see people having access to this information, you're gonna see more people coming to the Orthodox Church as they are down south, which is gonna speed up. You could get rid of a lot of garbage Islam. You could narrow down the Judaism, and we could actually argue about these things in front of people without killing each other. But they don't want that. They'd rather things continue the way they are. Relations between the West and the Arab states were evolving past the very old antagonisms until Zionist machinations entered the scene during World War I. It's not too late to correct the distorted relationships that have occurred between the West and the Arabs, and then an amicable solution can be found to the problems of Muslim immigration. As I do agree with that. As for Breivik, he is a product more of the forces that are inimical to the traditional West. He is no more a conservative than the neocons who sprang from the bowels of Trotskyism, plutocracy, Zionism, and the CIA during the First Cold War. And it's more than that too, right? Because neoconservatives are a type of modern militaristic state-run thing with all these things and the modern military state and the brainwashing, but they have roots back to Jacobinism. And the Girondists were a type of more conservative Jacobins. And when the French Revolution was basically defeated, when it ran into the ground and Napoleon takes over, okay? Napoleon makes it a little bit more conservative. And they preempt and copy his system that's raising kids into militarism from a young age. They talked about Sparta and stuff and these ancient Greeks. And they boarded kids and took them from their families to raise them as soldiers. So in Prussia, they started copying this and doing it in a more conservative manner. And when the Prussians destroyed Napoleon in battle, the whole world was enamored by them, and this Prussian system came over here. Right after the world, we installed it with the Civil War, and it really locked itself in, and it continues on. That's when America got into expansionism and interventionism, was post-Civil War. Then again, we had isolationism again, trying to come back and not wanting to get into the world wars. But then you can see here we talked about how the government wanted to break out of that. And one of the things he blames it on World War I with Zionism. That was definitely a factor. But it's also a factor that we had our own elites. We had, you got your Fords, you got your Rockefellers, your Morgans, you got the British Fabians that also had these different dialectical ideas, or they were just greedy, some of them, that wanted globalism. And they wanted us into the war. We wanted to have a scientific dictatorship. The Collins brothers have the Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship book. You got another one about the UFOs. And it really gets into this lineage of Jacobinism. We're really neo-Jacobins. One of the Jacobins, Carrier of Nantes, said, "We will turn all of France into a graveyard before we allow it to be regenerated in any other way." So you can kind of see this attitude that we have to save the whole world with democracy. Hippolyte Taine, when he wrote those French Revolution books of his that are really good, the history and his history and origins of contemporary France. There's two volumes on the French Revolution, maybe three, another one on Napoleon. He talked about how the twin-headed snake of democracy and military conscription ran together all through Europe after Napoleon and then the Prussian system, which we adopted here and moved away from America's policy that was more like the Swiss. We were anti-interventionist. And this Jacobinism is rampant within neoconservatism. It's been populist. These conservatives who are neocons are bitching about populism, the populist right, and all these unwashed masses. But they're fucking populist too ever since they got rid of Russell Kirk. They're full of it. We've been populist since we got rid of the church. That's all there is to it. It's ridiculous. So these are neo-Jacobins that want to go around and spread this war. And they have esoteric roots too in Rosicrucianism. There was an idea that if the sun set on the whole world and it was Christian by force with the British Empire, and earlier some of the Italians had this thought too, Dante had thoughts like this too about spreading. He was an imperialist. He was a monarchist. He wanted to have the emperor restore the kingdom together to stop all the civil war and fighting that was going on in Florence, because it was almost anarchic. You had the communes and people who lived in towers between the Welfs and the Ghibellines. The Welfs and the Ghibellines that would fight each other, and they would change their currency all the time. It was like microcosms of the French Revolution and anarchy there in Italy. So he wanted to have a strong emperor, but he thought if the emperor spread Christianity over the whole world and everything that the sun set on was Christian, then that would bring in the heavenly Jerusalem. That would bring in the second coming. So these neocons have this dispensationalist idea, a lot of them. Back when John Dee with Queen Elizabeth, he was like this spy and magician who had 007. He was the spy that 007 comes from, the way he used to stamp his letters. This guy was an esotericist who would summon angels and then did wife swapping because he was really summoning demons. Well, he actually was a proponent of this idea, and some of these ideas came into the Americas for imperialism. This is some of the ideas where some of the expansionists that we stopped with George Washington, a lot of the people like Hamilton, they wanted to have a second British Empire that would continue being expansionist and spreading these ideas over the world. And you start to see with Masonry, this stuff starts morphing though, and it starts moving with Masonry and Illuminism and Deism into something new. It also influences the Manifest Destiny when we start moving into the Indian territories. They start leveraging that, and when we try to go down to Mexico and everything. So this stuff keeps creeping back in. And then it gets caught up later on during the World Wars that we're going to fix everything. And there were similar ideas over there too in early eugenics that we're going to make everything one with the Wilson administration and pragmatism. John Dewey had a lot of utopian ideas. So you start to see this stuff get extracted into kind of like scientific Gnosticism. And then later on, when we get into after World War II into the Cold War, the CIA gets in with all these dispensationalists and pumps it. So with this Protestant dispensationalism, when the CIA works with Billy Graham and other evangelicals, they also start propping a lot of these people up. We even wanted to find a Billy Graham of the Muslim world, and Dyer talks about this a lot and has it heavily researched. He's talked about it with Engdahl. He's gone through all Mark Curtis's stuff. There's a paper, a dissertation called Blowback of the Gods. I think it's by James Wallace that gets into this. And there's a free version that's not paywalled. That's a shorter one called A Religious War that heavily documents how the CIA altered and used and infiltrated and leveraged religion as a tool, like we talked about earlier. Everyone wants to use this as a sociological tool. So you see Kerry Bolton trying to fight fire with fire here and use Islam in the same manner, but it's still this reduction. And they worked with these evangelicals who have an apocalyptic worldview. So what they think that if they put Israel there, they don't realize Israel is now the church. And they think if they put Israel there, that God will bless them with material profit. So they quote mine the Bible for this. And this was pumped by the CIA. And they gave special privilege to these evangelical preachers to push this stuff. You see Charlie Kirk putting up quotes like this. And he's there praying on the Jewish wall with his yarmulke on, but he's supposed to be Christian, yet he somehow tells himself he can believe Christ is the Messiah, while Netanyahu says he's going to bring in another Messiah, which we would actually think is Antichrist. They think they're going to get money for putting the Jews there, with this apocalypticism too. So they actually think they can cause an apocalypse and burn the world down. And this has been pumped by our CIA, and now when it starts moving into leftism, they still have an apocalyptic view. Even somebody like Brett Weinstein on the left, who's a moderate leftist, has these evolutionary views of process that we're going to apocalypse ourselves unless we transcend it, unless we transcend our evolution and individuate. Elon Musk, technocracy. And these elements are there in neoconservatism as well. And you see how this Rosicrucian-based kind of Protestantism that came out of the Rosicrucian Enlightenment and has these Jacobin roots still comes to these types of conclusions. You see the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers actually wrote about how we would have to, I think it was them, they wrote about how we would have to transcend pollution and super bacteria, and only the strong would be the elite that survived this kind of like evolutionary and climate apocalypse brought about by capitalism, but we would need to power through. And this would make an elect. They think that they're God's elect and they were destined to rule over everybody else because of his predestination. So you see Calvinism getting brought up into this, into a sort of Gnostic technocracy. It's very telling. And you see Mormonism is also amenable to some of this transhumanism. And Glenn Beck over there, he's all in for this dispensationalism. He says it's an honor for us to give our tax dollars to Israel. And then he doesn't seem to be too concerned with this world war at this point. Like, we don't want to have it for Ukraine, but we can have it for Israel and Russia's Gog and Magog. So these people have something very, very wrong, and it starts with their ideas and their theology. And this is one of the places where I think Kerry Bolton here is a little bit insufficient, where I think Nick Fuentes is insufficient, where I think this whole Hinkle and Haz movement is insufficient, or everybody that just blames the Jews or just blames the World Economic Forum. They don't understand the power of the ideas themselves. That doesn't mean we don't have agency, which a lot of people also forget that. They look at the conspiracy theory and they look at these big, powerful entities that exert a lot of force that we cannot ignore. Like a lot of individualists or people that say just fix yourself and be spiritual want to say, and say to ignore the culture war. I don't agree with that. But the individual and their agency work together with these elites, and they are also beholden to the ideas. The ideas have power. There's only so many presuppositions in ideas, and then they have outcomes when you live them. And there is metaphysical reality. So if you ignore that, you do that at your peril. And I think you really need to look at people who are philosophically and theologically sophisticated to get a better look at these things and understanding of them. Because this is the outcome of our ideas, as much as it is our own individual choices, and as much as it is the elites who we are in co-conspiracy with. I've been pretty critical of Jordan Peterson lately, but this is one of the things he noted and extracted out of Jung, who I'm very much antithetical to, but it's a good observation that people like that instead of Freud saying it was a conspiracy of the mother against the child to install all these problems, that the child is often in co-conspiracy with the mother. And I think in society, we're in co-conspiracy with these elites. We sit and buy all this stuff from China, and that's why our stuff has been outsourced. We eat garbage food and want to sit around and watch things instead of learning. We don't discipline ourselves. We don't have ascesis. We don't go to the church first. So we are in co-conspiracy with these elites because we allow them to enslave us with the things we enslave ourselves with. I think that's a better view. And Christianity is very well set to actually understand that, and it's in our doctrine in a coherent manner. We understand we're up against powers and principalities before men, but we also understand the corruption and corrupt princes and kings, corruption in the church, savage wolves. But we also understand the individual battle and the battle that is within your own soul, where you're supposed to fix yourself first. And you'll see people, even though we know there's conspiracy now. We've seen our government conspire against us with COVID, with elections. And conservatives will admit this, but as soon as we point to things that hurt the neoconservative worldview, they want to start calling everybody conspiracy theorists, just like the left does. The left does this when it challenges their worldview. And this is the point of delineation where a lot of people want a goalpost move now and go to, hey, you got to fix yourself first. Yeah, well, that's true. We do have to fix ourselves first. But we also have to address these big issues somehow in a coherent manner. And you'll see Christians who are ecumenists say, hey, you just have to be spiritual, ignore the culture war. You'll see Daniel Smachtenberger, Tristan Harris, and John Vervaeke will talk about corruption all the time, corruption and greed and corporations and the problems of the political class. But as soon as you start pointing to where their own spirituality is tied up with these things and part of the problem, now we're just being conspiratorial and we're having a hermeneutics of suspicion instead of a hermeneutics of beauty. There's people in the Catholic Church I've seen that are trying to uphold what the Pope is doing right now, using that to gaslight people. I see people in the meaning areas like the Mark Lefebvre and stuff. Everything is bad with the Democrats, got to vote out corruption. But as soon as we get into some of the stuff we're talking about here, and it indicts his worldview, and the CIA actually had religious ideas and was pushed by elites that have these philosophical ideas that are a Gnostic inversion of our religion and target our religion. No, that was just a big government mistake. but he knows better and we're going to get it right. You're just being a conspiracy theorist without actually addressing what is conspiracy and what is not. We actually have to look through it, whether or not the claims are true. And there is plenty of documentation. They don't want to talk about what we have to offer. People, one of the big things they goalpost move to here is fix yourself first, and talking about conspiracy is harmful and it drives people crazy. Well, it probably drives people crazy because of how corrupt things are and how deep the corruption goes and how malevolent the system we've co-created is that is aimed at us. Yeah, that'll make you a little bit crazy. One of the things that would make people less crazy and less having to go out there and dig up knowledge and show it to people to prove the point would be to actually have the people who represent us in conversation actually talk about it and hash it out. I don't think people would be so driven quite so crazy if that was actually distributed through the hierarchy and we could actually deal with and address the problems. Because guess what? The problem of this corruption and malevolence doesn't go away just because you don't look at it because it makes you feel better. It's more harmful to ignore it than have a group of corrupt, evil people unleash a virus on your society. It's more corrupt to have neocons drag you into endless wars and then turn around and advocate the same stuff the left does to control your speech and to be part of a corrupt uniparty that's selected itself through a pedophile island. That's more harmful than being driven a little crazy and dealing with some stress because you have to actually talk about something. And part of the reason we have to go through all this literature and bring all this shit up is because you people avoid it on all quarters. Left, right, center, libertarian, whatever. Whenever it indicts the worldview, people don't want to talk about it. The point of delineation for refusing to actually look into the facts and hash them out and cut out the garbage, because there are garbage, crazy conspiracies out there. But the point of delineation to not even talk about it at all and smear everybody that brings it up and play all these little games where even conservatives will turn into the left like for everybody's own good. Oh, it hurts their feelings. It's not good for them. Well, this is the same shit they pull with the microaggression, right? This stuff right here, the point of delineation when they play this game is when it challenges their worldview and their politics and their aims, or if it points to the church being the one true church. Now I want to get into the Collins brothers here. The Collins brothers, Philip Darrell Collins and Paul David Collins. The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century, expanded and revised edition. This is on page 200. Neoconservatism, the cult of techno-socialism. Of course, Brzezinski is one of the chief architects of the geostrategy that was implemented by the Bush administration immediately after September 11, 2001. The administration of George W. Bush is peopled largely by a faction of the power elite known as the neoconservatives. Researchers of both the left and the right have identified the neoconservatives as distinctly anti-democratic, having anti-democratic elements. The exposure has led to mounting opposition against the neoconservative agenda from numerous grassroots activists. Now, several neoconservatives are launching a counterattack. The strategy is one of vilification. In an article for the National Review, Michael Rubin characterized the neocons' opponents as anti-Semites obsessed with conspiracy theories. Max Boot continues with the conspiracy theory angle, claiming the neocons' opponents have an overactive imagination, of what we were just talking about, right? A cabal of neoconservatives has hijacked the Bush administration, foreign policy, and transformed the world's sole superpower into a unilateral monster. Say what? In truth, stories about the neocon ascendancy and the group's insidious intent to wage preemptive wars across the globe has been much exaggerated. And by telling such tall tales, critics have twisted the neocons' identities in thinking on U.S. foreign policy into an unrecognizable caricature. End quote. Why have the neocons' retaliation been so aggressive? Do they simply wish to set the record straight? Are Rubin and Boot merely trying to correct several misconceptions over neoconservatism? The tone of their rhetoric and apologetics suggest another motivation: obfuscation. The neocons realize that continued exposure will eventually lead to the destruction of even the most well-constructed disguise. One individual who relates that the neocons have camouflaged their real intentions is Pulitzer Prize-winning author Seymour Hersh. Hersh characterizes the neocons in the following way, quote, "One of the things that you could say is, the amazing thing is we are being taken over basically by a cult. 8 or 9 neoconservatives have somehow grabbed the government." End quote. Cults are usually very adept at the concealment game. Many times they masquerade so effectively that a group's own members do not even realize they are part of a cult. What lies at the center of the cult of neoconservatism? The neoconservative cult has always paraded around under a patriotic, pro-American, anti-communist facade. What lies behind this veneer? Frank Fisher answers this question in his book, Technocracy and the Politics of Expertise. Quote, neoconservatism is at the base an elitist ideology aimed at promoting a new group of conservative technocrats, end quote. To promote their own variety of technocracy, neoconservatives present themselves as the antithesis to left-wing policy professionals. However, the conflict between these two is superficial at best. As is the case with all good Hegelian dialectics, the neoconservative antithesis is not dichotomously related to its alleged technocratic opposition. Fisher elaborates. Neoconservatives regularly argue that knowledge elites are a threat to democracy. But if this is their primary concern, their solution is scarcely designed to remedy the problem. Indeed, by challenging the Democratic Party's use of policy expertise with a counterintelligentsia, they implicitly accept and approve of the evolving technocratic terrain. Developing a conservative cadre of policy and analysts cannot be interpreted as a measure designed to return the power to the people. End quote. Exactly. So we just set up our own, we keep playing this game, and it goes back and forth in a sort of arms race. And it ends up in the military-industrial complexes. You end up with your Koch brothers. You end up with people who think Elon Musk is going to be the greatest hero for us, even though he's a transhumanist. And they're setting up a new type of elite. They want to set up this everything app. He wants to put chips in you. He believes in dataism. This is part of the reason David Patrick Harry did a great stream on dataism and also clipped it on Elon Musk. He has a short there. And how Elon, part of the reason he believes in this freedom of information and freedom of speech is that it keeps the flow of data going endlessly. It's a monism. It's no boundaries. And we'll be beholden to that by using it as the way to try to defeat it. I guess we're all a little bit guilty if we're trying to get our information out there on it too, right? I wonder about that a lot. Fisher correctly argues that neoconservatism's advocacy of a so-called conservative cadre of policy analysts precludes citizen participation. Quote, neoconservatives doubtless maintain that their policy advisors speak for different political values. Rather than the welfare state and bureaucratic paternalism, conservative experts advocate democracy and free market individualism. Such an argument, however, fails to address the critical issue. As a system of decision-making geared toward the expert knowledge, technocracy, liberal or conservative necessarily, blocks the meaningful participation of the average citizen. Ultimately, only those who can interpret the complex technical languages that increasingly frame economic and social issues have access to play the power democratic rhetoric side. Those who nurture a conservative intelligentsia in reality only help to extend an elite system of policy making. End quote. You hear a bunch of this jargon. The little tiny bit I heard of the debates, the Republican debates last night, they get into all this jargon about these policies and how we have to do this and that to keep everybody alive and in their perfect policies. How we're going to fix Medicare and all this gets into a lot of this jargon. When they did the report on 9/11, it got into so much jargon in the same way postmodernism gets into obscurantism that Jordan Peterson talks about, but you see this game being played here as well. So to say it's only the left-wingers or the postmodernists that are playing this game, that's not true. It's happening here. They framed it as though if you can't understand and describe the entire world, you can't know anything, and now we have to get our nose involved in everything and have constant surveillance and totalizing input of data, just like this Internet of Things. And Jay Dyer and James Lindsay and Stephen Coughlin and Courtney Turner get into that in the video Alchemy and the Science of Dialectical Manipulation. Continued. Whether under the superfluous appellations of conservative or liberal policy professionals, still constitute what Wells referred to as a democracy of experts. Neoconservatism's promotion of its own policy professionals betrays the ideology's technocratic propensities. Rhetoric concerning democracy and free market individualism amounts to little more than pageantry. Neoconservatism is but the latest incarnation of the technocratic movement and represents another stage in the sociopolitical Darwinism's metastasis. Always looming on the horizon is a scientific dictatorship. Neoconservatism's technocratic pedigree is also graphically illustrated by its adherents' strong support for FDR's New Deal. Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, states in his book Neoconservatism, the autobiography of an idea, that neocons accepted the New Deal in principle. Later in his book, Kristol writes, quote, "In a way, the symbol of the influence of neoconservative thinking on the Republican Party was the fact that Ronald Reagan could praise Franklin D. Roosevelt as a great American president, praised echoed by Newt Gingrich a dozen years later, when it is no longer surprising." End quote. And Newt Gingrich is a example of one of these so-called experts that knows all this stuff. And if you want to get into FDR and his support and how he got into this power and took over with this stuff, Anthony Sutton's Wall Street trilogy has a good one on FDR that I've only skimmed it, but reading the other books that he's written and also hearing it lectured about, it seems to be pretty legit. Why were neoconservatives so amicable towards the socialism of the New Deal? The answer is because Roosevelt's Marxist proclivities harmonized with the neoconservative variety of technocracy. It is interesting to know that the godfather, Kristol, was a Trotskyite in his youth. Kristol makes it clear that he is unrepentant. Quote, "I regard myself lucky to have been a young Trotskyite, and I have not a single bitter memory." End quote. The statist tradition found in Marxism is also carried on by the neocons. This is another point made clear by Kristol. Quote, "Neocons do not feel that kind of alarm or anxiety about the growth of the state in the past century, seeing it as natural, indeed inevitable." End quote. So here you see this kind of Marxist determinism. It's inevitable. This is the course of history, and we have to go with it. And the only way to escape from not really having an afterlife and participation with God is to enforce our will on reality and to be a part of this. You even see smaller versions of this, I think, in the Vervaeke Project, where everyone, without like a real concrete afterlife, they're going to be a part of the future with ideas and these ideas of virtue and making a new religion, and they live on that way. That's their way of dealing with subspecies Iaterna. But that logic gets steamrolled. This is one of the things Father Seraphim Rose talks about. That logic is steamrolled when people got to show so hard and cling to them doing it by themselves that they can be good without God. The more profound and powerful logic comes from Ivan Karamazov when he says, without God, anything is permissible. And we're seeing this actually play out. I mean, you're seeing Noah Yuval Harari go full Nietzsche. There's nothing bad. Anything is good just because it exists. Everything is permissible. Seeing people move towards like normalizing pedophilia and bestiality. With this determinism too here. The determinism puts them in a trap where they feel like they must get out of it. And this is the Marxist must alter the world to alter man himself. This is why Huxley ends up in a revolution against man himself. This is why the transhumanists are against man himself. Father Peter Heers on Orthodox Ethos has a really good lecture on transhumanism, and another one he did with David Patrick Harry on Kotel, who's again doing his thesis, his dissertation on transhumanism, that one of the people writing about transhumanism said humans, when we lose our anthropology and God, that isn't about us, it's about God first, and that's what nests and grounds our anthropology rather than humanism that ends in anti-humanism, obviously. That some of these people for transhumanism that are a big part of the movement writing papers write that people who do not go along with this, moving towards the singularity, are 8-brained meat sacks. So we're less than human. You already know where that will end up. Let's keep going. Marxist economic theory remains firmly embedded within neoconservative ideology. Several neoconservative ideologues have espoused socialist ideas. Former neoconservative Michael Lind admits, "The fact that most of the younger neocons were never on the left is irrelevant. They are the intellectual, and in the case of William Kristol and John Podhoretz, the literal, heirs of the older ex-leftists. The idea that the United States and similar societies are dominated by a decadent, post-bourgeois new class was developed by thinkers in the Trotskyite tradition like James Burnham and Max Schnachtmann, who influenced an older generation of neocons. The concept of the global democratic revolution has its origins in the Trotskyite Fourth International's vision of permanent revolution. The economic determinist idea that liberal democracy is an epiphenomenon of capitalism, promoted by the neocons like Michael Novak, is simply Marxism with entrepreneurs substituted for proletarians as the heroic subjects of history. End quote. This is some of the stuff that Zizek got into with Peterson. I'm not a Zizek fan, but capitalism isn't necessarily an antithesis to socialism. It's more of a synthesis. Most of this stuff has been funded by capitalists, and Dyer is great on that. Arch neocon William F. Buckley provides a prime example of neoconservative ideology who has espoused socialist ideas. Buckley has written, Congress shall appropriate funds for social welfare only where the benefit of those states whose per capita income is below the national average. End quote. Commentating on Buckley's statement, researcher Ralph Epperson writes, quote, the writer, Buckley, advocated a newer brand of Marxism, from each state according to its ability to each state according to its needs, end quote. This writer advocated that the national government divide the wealth, taking it from the wealthier states and giving it to the less productive. Pure Marxism, except the writer involved both the state and the federal government rather than just the federal government as Marx envisioned. This is only expanding Marx one step. The result is the same. Property is distributed by the government just as before. The shock is that the new thought came from the pen of William F. Buckley Jr., hardly a paragon of Marxism. But notice that Buckley's intent is the same as that of Marx. To use the government to redistribute consumption and capital goods, end quote. So you see here, too, one of the things that William F. Buckley was, even if there was this Marxism there, he's a dialectician, but Marxism can change. It can take the antithesis of its position and synthesize with it. It's subject to change. And Fabian socialism is a form of it. And Fabian socialism is more amenable to capitalism. And guess what? William F. Buckley was knighted and had ties to the British, and he was likely a Fabian. And he was a CIA operative. So they're pushing these types of ideas. And what you get here is almost like a social credit score system. We can take money away from countries, and then we can give it to others as needed. When we determine they get the need, we can exhaust and oppress our own people into austerity while funding Ukraine, while funding Israel, and keep going on with these wars and then gain more powers. It's very telling here. But then a country that's bad and wants to go back to tradition and is seen, as we talked about last time, as rejectionist, can be punished and have funds withheld even though it's become dependent on them, just like the welfare state worked with individuals here in America. You're seeing a lot of these countries now flip and turn to Russia because they want to uphold tradition and get rid of gender studies, and then the UN holds money from them. Continued. No doubt these Marxist proclivities were a consequence of neoconservatism's technocratic heritage. Of course, there are those who would argue that the technocratic tradition has been at variance with Marxism. Indeed, technocratic and Marxist theoreticians have feuded on occasion, yet the common thread of state socialism binds both, as is evidenced by their closely aligned economic policies and virtually identical outcomes. In fact, some sects of the early technocratic movement mingled socialism, managerialism, and assorted beliefs with relative ease. Many were also anti-capitalist and revolutionary in their rhetoric. William Aiken further examines the continuity of Marxist thought endemic to the early technocratic movement. In California, adherents visualized an efficient totalitarian society in which the individual must subordinate himself to the community, and which would function automatically under the guidance of engineers. The American Technocratic League of Denver was openly socialist. From Chicago, the All-American Technological Society proposed the use of the Soviet Union as a model for the new order, end quote. The petty differences between theoreticians become inconsequential. Technocracy was a logical outgrowth of earlier variants of socialism. The ideational continuum appears to have been a drift from Bellamyism to technocracy to New Deal socialism. Neoconservatism is the latest segment of this larger continuity of thought. As neo-Jacobins and technocrats, they remain committed to the erection of a scientific dictatorship. And that this is the spirit of something. I mean, you have to discern the spirits and the trajectory of something and what the consequences are of having certain beliefs and presuppositions. There's a very good point here that these little petty differences are insufficient. And you see a lot of intellectuals. You'll even see somebody like a Dr. Vervaeke talk about propositional beliefs and that they don't matter. But then when he's challenged on the outcomes of his project, he'll go back to his propositions and will say, oh, no, I was against idolatry here. No, I don't believe in that. See, I have a statement. Yeah, I have a proposition, but your propositions don't actually always stop it. They don't matter. It's one of the insights Nietzsche actually had about Hegel was that the trajectory of what he aimed, or where he says that you don't identify with history. He makes that propositionally off limits. Well, the nature of Chiliasm, the Chiliasm and the dispensationalism that was there are extracted into Hegel, this hope to bring in a new world, the hope for the apocalypse, the hope to make it happen, to escape tribulation. This is there in Hegel, and it's in the general mind and disposition of the people. So when Nietzsche criticizes him, I think in Thoughts Out of Season, he says it really doesn't matter if you make that off limits. It's still what people are going to do, and it's been the result of Hegelianism. It's the direction it would head. And I think it's a pretty good critique. Next is Perpetual War for Perpetual Evolution. In his book, Evolution and Ethics, Darwinian Sir Arthur Keith wrote, "If war be the progeny of evolution, and I am convinced that it is, then evolution has gone mad, reaching such a height of ferocity as must frustrate its proper role in the world of life, which is the advancement of our competing units, these being tribes, nations, or races of mankind. There is no way of getting rid of war save one, and that is to rid human nature of the sanctions imposed on it by the law of evolution. Can man render the law of evolution null and void? I've discovered no way that is at once possible and practicable." In characterizing war as the progeny of evolution, Keith makes it clear that the conflict is the natural corollary of man's purported Darwinian ascent. Of course, Darwinism rests heavily upon the concept of natural selection, which depicts life as an enormous struggle for survival. On the microcosmic level, the struggle is bodied forth by the competition between species. On a macrocosmic level, this struggle manifests itself as a war between nations. Thus, Keith establishes the centrality of war to evolutionary development. Jacques Barzun eloquently reiterates this contention. Darwin did not invent the Machiavellian image that the world is the playground of the lion and the fox, but thousands discovered that he had transformed political science. War became the symbol, the image, the inducement, the reason, and the language of all human beings on the planet. No one who has not waded through some sizable part of the literature of the period, 1870 through 1914, has any conception of the extent to which it is one long call for blood. Indeed, Darwinism totally altered political science. Now questions of governance and administration of human affairs assumed an evolutionary character. In turn, the political terrain of the modern world is dominated by a criminal elite, which perpetuates a Darwinian power structure. Their supernatural machinations, such as the IMF and World Bank, are designed according to evolutionary principles. Because the paradigmatic character of governance is now distinctly evolutionary, national governments follow an inherently Darwinian course. Commensurate with this course is the continuous provocation of wars. In short, the primacy of evolutionary theory in political science has predisposed the nations of the world to perpetual war. The ruling class has a stake in engineering global conflicts. Not only do wars cull surplus populations, thus satisfying the Malthusian precepts of Darwinism, but also they tangibly enact the dialectical framework intrinsic to evolutionary theory. This framework is Hegelian. With this population control, too, you see some of the Greeks actually said this. I forget which one, but one of them then said that the war in Troy was necessary because Zeus saw too many people were on the planet. You get this kind of Gnostic ideology where there's an archon that has to do these types of things. This framework is Hegelian. The organism, thesis, comes into conflict with nature, the antithesis, resulting in a newly enhanced species, synthesis, the culmination of the evolutionary process. So now we always have to beat this. We're always running from it. It is the hope of the elite that through the continuous promulgation of warfare, this harmonious synthesis shall be tangibly realized. In this context, war serves as an alchemical function. Over the years, the various scientific dictatorships of the world have assumed convergent trajectories. While making war with one another, these scientific dictatorships simultaneously synthesize the birth of a new authoritarian regime. Why? In reality, these scientific dictatorships have been little more than variants of the same socialist totalitarian system. Thus, the ostensible conflicts among these competing socialist regimes actually represent incremental phases in a process of coalitional integration. The final Hegelian synthesis is intended to be a global scientific dictatorship. So if we see this kind of alchemical process moving towards total oneness, and we have these one and the many problems, one of the people that talked about this, we got Carl Jung's famous UFO essay, and I would subscribe. It's my personal view, and I believe it. And Father Seraphim Rose's take and the Orthodox take that these are demons, and that man is tempted into this. But if we go to this idea of alchemy and synthesis, and Hegel pulls from alchemy, even James Lindsay, like we talked about, looks at this stuff as alchemical in its origin, even if he doesn't grant it the supernatural reality. This is at the end of Jung's essay. So he talks about UFOs as a symbol and a loss of religion, and that there's something that they're interacting with. And this is how he ends. It seems to me, remember, this is after the first two world wars, when the Cold War is starting and everyone's worried about the hydrogen bomb and the fact we could be wiped out, and the kind of threat and terror, if you look at the Tavistock books, that was used to scare everybody into complete compliance and brainwashing. And that this has been over us, driving and remaking us. And we always have to come to some way to escape nuking ourselves, just like this chapter was just talking about escaping war by beating evolution or evolving into something new. So war is a good thing that can move us. So this is a tool for these elites, just like COVID was the way they used it. Here's Jung. It seems to me, speaking with all due reserve, that there is a third possibility, that UFOs are a real material phenomena of an unknown nature, presumably coming from outer space, which perhaps have long been visible to mankind. Keep in mind here that the World Economic Forum is going to do a full disclosure. Supposedly, we had that fake alien. I'm sure I think they're just preparing us with pre-operant conditioning to do something that they invest a little more time and money into. Presumably coming from outer space, which perhaps have long been visible to mankind, but otherwise have no recognizable connection with the Earth or its inhabitants. In recent times, however, and just at the moment when the eyes of mankind are turned towards the heaven, partly on account of their fantasies about possible spaceships, and partly in a figurative sense because their earthly existence is threatened, unconscious contents have projected themselves on these inexplicable heavenly phenomena and giving them a significance they in no way deserve. Since they seem to have appeared more frequently after the Second World War than before, it may be that they are synchronistic phenomena or meaningful coincidences. The psychic situation of mankind and the UFO phenomena as a physical reality bear no recognizable causal relationship to one another, but they seem to coincide in a meaningful manner. So here what Jung is saying, without any proof or evidence, is that there's something going on in the world of forms, and in the objective reality we could never know in itself with this Kantian divide, but then our unconscious wants to connect to it, and it's meaningfully the way time is moving forward into some new grand alchemical synthesis is working with man's unconscious that comes together into some kind of new meaning and creation of new things. And this is driven by some subconscious need that we have. The meaningful connection is the product on the one hand of projection and on the other of round and cylindrical forms which embody the projected meaning and have always symbolized the union of opposites. So here we see this thesis and antithesis right now, right? So here, cause war, and man will kill himself. Now we need something. We need something to happen, and it needs to connect to some kind of metaphysical reality that's Jung's justification, but isn't grounded in anything or subject to any kind of dogma. But it's incoherent, and you can't really prove it. It's just you're taking this meaningful coincidence and then saying you have a mission and you're justified in doing this. Another equally chance coincidence is the choice of the national emblems for aircraft in the USSR and the USA, respectively a red and white 5-pointed star. For 1,000 years, red was regarded as the masculine and white as the feminine color. The alchemists spoke of the servus rubis, red slave, and the femina candida, white woman. Their copulation produced the supreme union of opposites. When one speaks of Russia, one immediately thinks of Little Father Tsar and Little Father Stalin. Also, one remembers all the talk about America being a matriarchy because the bulk of American capital is in the hands of women, not to mention Kesselring's bon mot about the aunt of the nation. So he's just making shit up here and finding one type of meaning to focus on. He's engaged in bullshit artistry to have these archetypal ideas to justify doing something. This is the same kind of stuff we talked about with John Dee. It is clear that these parallels have nothing to do with the choice of symbols, at any rate, not as a conscious causality. Comically enough, one must say, red and white are nuptial colors. They throw an amusing light on Soviet Russia as the reluctant or unrequited lover of the femina candida in the White House, even if there is nothing more to it than that. His point here is that there's some psychic drive that we must blend these two nations together into a new way of being. This is Eric Neumann's point that we'll keep going back and forth on the one and the many scale into mass recollectivization. If we can't come up with a new way of being between and blend the East and the West, it's a justification for a new religion. You see the shit with Vervaeke too that Dyer's heavily critiqued. We're going to come up with something new. We're going to build these silicone sages, and because we need it, we feel good, we've justified it and followed these archetypal patterns, whether or not they could be leading us astray or are something we should do, it'll magically work out for the good, and it's bullshit. But you can see this desire, this psychological desire through archetypal thinking. That's the same as this alchemical idea of bringing in scientific dictatorships where they want to blend nations and ways of being. And you start seeing people trying to bring in Islam and blend it with Christianity. You see these people trying to blend the communism and the capitalism together. People upholding the Communist Party or looking at Stalin when he turned communism anti-Zionist and nationalist. You see a synthesis. So you're trying to stop these elites with the same thing. You're trying to stop them with the same thing that they're doing, and you're part of the problem. That's why you need a metaphysics and a theology that's non-dialectical. It makes the actual truth and the good, gives it primacy in Christ. War is integral to the elite's evolutionary script, facilitating the dialectical convergence of the many scientific dictatorships littering the globe. The Hegelian synthesis of the world's various scientific dictatorships into a global government stipulates continual war. In turn, such perpetual conflict requires the manufacturing of adversaries to engage in fraudulent skirmishes. In short, war is alchemy. To them, it's fire. And I've seen them say this. Anderson Todd, who advises John Vervaeke. I've seen Robert Bosnak, who's a student of James Hillman, student of Carl Jung, back when I was going through Peterson. We're like in an alchemical vessel now with COVID, but the heat's up, so we have to make something new, a new mode of being. This is licensed to do something, and everyone was so happy that COVID happened. Not everyone, but there were people that thought like we weren't going to have fucking jobs anymore, and everyone would work from home, and it'll all just be good, even if we kill a bunch of people. So this is something that affects change, because they're determinists, and they don't believe that there's an actual God. They need something else. And they need to affect change on the world. And they get into a mode of thinking that with some of these elite that's pretty much satanic, where they have license as creators to play God. So, into a global government that stipulates continual war. In short, war is alchemy. By synthesizing metallurgy, physics, occultism, and several other fields of study, the alchemists hope to ultimately achieve the transmutation of man himself. Today, the power elite strive toward the same end, but through the synthesizing of global powers instead. War is one of the chief means by which the synthesis is achieved. And if you look at Huxley in Brave New World, which he actually, in his Berkeley speech, said was a real plan, and everyone's basically too stupid to do anything about it, and you wouldn't believe it, and if you did, you couldn't stop it. It opens how the whole Brave New World came about was after gases and nuclear weapons were used, and to half the world's killed off, and then who's left under this kind of social Darwinism has to live under this authoritative system that comes up with a new way of being. They remove all guilt. It's Christianity without the tears. It's an antichrist religion. They even frame Mustafa Mond, the world controller, as a type of antichrist when he says suffer little children, when he tells a little girl to go run along and do her erotic play. This is the same shit we're seeing with the groomers. So they want to remove all constraints, go beyond good and evil. Nietzsche shit. It's demonic. Disgusting. Report from Iron Mountain. The plans for perpetual warfare were most thoroughly delineated within the report from the Iron Mountain on the possibility and desirability of peace. Released in 1966, this document purported to be the product of a special study group of 15 men whose identities were to remain secret. For several years, the authenticity of the report has been in question. The skepticism only intensified when the document's author publicly declared that the report was a satire. However, other parties with substantial credibility have defended the authenticity of the report from Iron Mountain. For instance, Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who acted as an advisor to President Kennedy, stated, "During the Kennedy years, People within the government discussed frequently and quite seriously many of the major questions phrased by Leonard Lewin in Report from Iron Mountain. I had been assigned to the office of the Secretary of Defense before the Kennedy election, and was there when the McNamara team of whiz kids arrived. Never before had so many brilliant young civilians with so many PhDs worked in that office. It was out of the mouths of this group that I heard so frequently and precisely the ideas that Lewin recounts in his novel. The report from Iron Mountain became a proverbial hot potato and changed hands several times. Its authorship was even attributed to William F. Buckley, a veritable icon among neoconservatives, irrespective of who authored the document. Its precise delineation of the ruling class tactics and its accuracy in prognosticating future events is difficult to deny. And that's a good way, too, to look at documents that are in question like this, is it as if they're true at least. Whether the document is genuine or some elaborate hoax, its didactic value remains intact. Questions of morality and individual freedom were not addressed in the report from the Iron Mountain. In fact, the report only briefly mentions the concepts of human liberty and ethics, regarding them as anachronistic concepts embraced by a bygone generation. The study concerned itself solely with the perpetuation of an absolute state and elitist power structure. The report stated, previous studies have taken the desirability of peace, the importance of human life, the superiority of democratic institution, the greatest good for the greatest number, the dignity of the individual, and other such wishful premises as axiomatic values necessary for the justification of a study of peace. We have not found them so. We have attempted to apply the standards of physical science to our thinking, the principal characteristics of which is not quantification, as is popularly believed, but that, in Whitehead's words, it ignores all judgments of values, for instance, all aesthetic and moral judgments. Evident in this statement is the power elite's fanatically religious adherence to the doctrine of scientism. The doctrine of scientism rigorously promotes the ecumenical imposition of physical science upon all fields of inquiry. Researcher Michael Hoffman succinctly revealed the inherent folly of scientism. Quote, the reason that science is a bad master and dangerous servant and ought not to be worshipped is that science is not objective. Science is fundamentally about the uses of the measurement. What does not fit in the yardstick of the scientist is discarded. Scientific determinism has repeatedly excluded some data from its measurement and fudged other data, such as Piltdown Man, in order to support the self-fulfilling nature of its own agenda, be it Darwinism or cut, burn, and poison methods of cancer treatment. The dominant epistemological paradigm of today is one governed by scientific determinism. Now, institutionally accredited science is the infallible dogma of a new theocracy. Human beings are reduced to quantifiable entities for the scrutiny of priests donning lab coats. Atop the highest plateau of this epistemological hierarchy sits the power elite, whose scientism selectively excludes any data that could be disproportionate with the ultimate agenda, complete social control. And we see this with Fauci and the reversal of positions. I am the science. It's just whatever they say it is. According to the reports from Iron Mountain, the desirability of peace, the importance of human life, the superiority of democratic institutions, the greatest good for the purpose of the greatest number, the dignity of the individual, and other such wishful premises are disproportionate with the yardstick of physical science. Since science ignores all judgments of value, for instance, all aesthetic and moral judgments, there is no place for axiomatic values in a global scientific dictatorship. And this is John Vervaeke here in the conversation he had with Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot. He admitted that the science itself is trying to make it like a mode of being is a black hole at the bottom of everything. But he still, to make it more important than it should be, it turns everything else into abstraction, and it's still the end result. That's an inconsequential critique to uphold what he tries to uphold and remain a naturalist. You see this with the Matt Dillahunty debate recently with Andrew Wilson. All these things, the greatest good, it's all subjective, it's all relative, it's not grounded in anything, it's whatever they want it to be. Then they claim they're better because they have science, yet they can't admit scientific facts when they don't want to. And as soon as they're challenged on it with their dogmas of, say, transgenderism and this hope that they can transcend every natural categories in a Gnostic manner, they can't have the debate. And you can see how brainwashed everybody was in this debate. The document proceeds to examine the necessity of war, declaring, and remember, this transgenderism, too, if we want to talk about war, is an internal psychological warfare here, and it's waged even on the family. It's waged to keep everybody fighting over everything all the time in an alchemical dialectic. so the dialectic can continue. The war system, not only, but with these neocons, it's literal war. The war system not only has been essential to the existence of nations as independent political entities, but has been equally indispensable to their stable political structure. Without it, no government has ever been able to obtain acquiescence in its legitimacy or right to rule its society. And we've seen massive government authority given with these wars, from the first two world wars, the war on terror, that's something, an amorphous thing that never ends, the war on drugs. All this stuff gives our government tons of power. Half the stuff Obama did, he got the power to do from Bush. And we also get, because we have this propaganda and we play these dialectical games, you see innocent people being killed. You see it on both sides of this. One side sees all the innocent Israelis and everything that's terrible about Hamas. And then we see the great crimes of Israel, where they're murdering all these innocent kids, and everyone sees that. And then you foment activism and emotionalism and anger and rage. And since the 60s with the new left, where you get the anti-war left, this is also what got Barack Obama elected. And you can see this going on now, and they're dividing everybody up into an epistemic fracture with footage of war, and they can have it coming in at real time now, and you don't know what's real and what's not some of the time. So the power that you can give your government, now they can say they have to have AI fact checkers, and they get to decide what's real and what's not. Which is what this alchemical stuff is about. It's an enforcement of man's will on reality. It's an apotheosis, to become as God without God's grace. You know, it's thelema. It's very Crowleyan. This is one of the things Dyer was discussing with the chessboard with the Masons. It's because you're above the good and the evil. You're above the black and the white, and you can manipulate the board. Everything is your chess pieces. And even from a secular worldview, you could look at that with Ian McGilchrist, where it starts to become this left hemispheric kind of having mode thing, where you're grabbing everything and it's predatory. And you reduce everything, you chop everything up. It's autistic. The possibility of war provides this sense of external necessity without which no government can long remain in power. The historical record reveals one instance after another where the failure of a regime to maintain the credibility of a war threat led to its dissolution, by the forces of private interest, of reactions to social injustice, or of any other disintegrative elements. The organization of society for the possibility of war is its principal political stabilizer. It has enabled societies to maintain necessary class distinctions, and it has ensured the subordination of the citizens to the state by the virtue of the residual powers inherent in the concept of nationhood. Again, that reference I keep making to the French Revolution where they did this. And you see the ruling class of the experts in Plato, the philosopher kings, and then you see the soldier class, and then the plebs. With the ever-present threat of war, the absolute state could maintain a standing army and implement a policy of compulsory service for its citizenry. Gemestos Platon is another one. According to the study, this system of obligatory service would provide the socially maladjusted and economically disadvantaged elements of society with a function. Thus, these potential enemies of society could be placated and pacified. The report elaborates. We will examine the time-honored use of military institutions to provide antisocial elements with an acceptable role in the social structure. The current euphemistic cliches, juvenile delinquency and alienation, have had their counterparts in every age. In earlier days, these conditions were dealt with directly by the military without the complications of due process, usually through press gangs or outright enslavement. Most proposals that address themselves, explicitly or otherwise, to the post-war problem of controlling the socially alienated turn to some variant of the Peace Corps, or the so-called Job Corps for a solution. The socially disaffected, the economically unprepared, the psychologically uncomfortable, the hardcore delinquents, the incorrigible, subversives, and the rest of the unemployable are seen as somehow transformed by the disciplines of a service modeled on military precedent into more or less dedicated social service workers. Another possible surrogate for the control of potential enemies of society is the reintroduction, in some form consistent with modern technology and political process, of slavery. It is entirely possible that the development of a sophisticated form of slavery may be an absolute prerequisite for social control in a world at peace. As a practical matter, conversion of the code of military discipline to a euphemized form of slavery would entail surprisingly little revision. The logical first step would be the adoption of some form of universal military service. And now that we're entering into this postmodern and post-human phase, and total egalitarian equality. This will be for everybody. This will be for your daughters too, and they're already introducing surrogacy out of the womb. Is something that they would like to do within the next decade. So they can totally get rid of that and they can start raising people the way they want them raised and made. The concluding remarks for this excerpt are particularly interesting. According to the report, the Code of Military Discipline is easily adapted to the standard civilian cultural milieu. Central to the military model is what late philosopher Michel Foucault dubbed the panoptic schema. It is this highly versatile constituent of the military system that makes the adaptation of a similar authoritarian model to non-combat environments relatively simple. Based on Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, the panoptic schema is a mechanism that allows for complete surveillance of the subject. Pan equals all, optic equals seeing. Originally a hallmark of the prison system, the panoptic schema can assume numerous forms. It can be the security camera, the barbed wire fence, and the armed guard. However, it does have much more subtle manifestations. Panoptic schema can also be bodied forth through the rigid timetable of activities, which allows for the effective chronometric regulation of the subject's day. It is tangibly enacted by the observational design of specific types of architecture, which readily lend themselves for the spatial regulation of the subject. Finally, it is within the mind of the subject himself, who has internalized all the mechanisms of control and now monitors his own behavior. And this is one of the things you're seeing with this Internet of Things now. You see this at the way an Amazon facility operates because there's constant data coming in all the time. There's a camera everywhere so they can see everything you do. And when you scan things, they get real data on what's coming in and who needs to go where. So they can see everything you do and your rates, and they gamify everything. And one of the things Dyer talked about, he talked about that the smart cities were going to probably model themselves after some of these like Disneylands where you go in and it's a Star Wars land and it operates like a choose your own adventure and they remember things you did. Then when you go to another part of the town, they operate based on what you did earlier. And right now you have Firefly as a technology that can integrate with clothing, and it can put it's going to be used for digital things that'll mix with Google Glass. So your Google Glasses will be a heads-up display, and then you could see a taxi cab, and then there would be an icon or an avatar above it, like in Grand Theft Auto. You could see, the cross above the ambulance. So you'll have this heads-up display, and they are actually trying to make this work with clothing devices so that you can LARP in real life. You could, go around looking like a furry or a dragon or a transgender or whatever you want to be in your own little reality. So they could take this kind of stuff to monitor everything you do and gamify you in a smart city that does regulate what you do throughout the day. And it could be they could model a lot of stuff off of the prison system like he's talked about here. Commenting on the metastasis of the panoptic schema, Foucault observes that it is polyvalent in its applications. It serves to reform prisoner, but also to treat patients, to instruct school children, to confine the insane, to supervise workers, to put beggars and idlers to work. It is a type of location of bodies in space, of distribution of individuals in relation to one another, of hierarchical organization, of disposition of centers and channels of power, of definition of the instruments and modes of intervention of power, which can be implemented in hospitals, workshops, schools, and prisons. Whenever one is dealing with a multiplicity of individuals on whom a task or particular form of behavior must be imposed, the panoptic schema may be used. According to Foucault, the elasticity of the panoptic schema allowed for its mass diffusion throughout society. Quote, the panoptic schema, without disappearing as such or losing any of its properties, was designed to spread throughout the social body, end quote. With the metastasis of the panoptic schema, Foucault observes that its vocation was to become a generalized function. Given the polyvalence of the panoptic schema, the report from Iron Mountain seems correct in asserting that society's conversion into a carceral culture involves surprisingly little revision. The final result, Foucault observes, is a virtually mechanized society. Quote, we are neither in the amphitheater nor on the stage, but in the panoptic machine. You see how this view is so mechanistic and anti-life and anti-human. Invested by its effects of power, which we bring to ourselves since we are part of the mechanism. The concept of the panoptic machine synchronizes very comfortably with Weishaupt's society of the Massenmenschen. Ever present is the machine motive, which was also a hallmark of the technocratic movement of the early 30s. It comes as little surprise that the Bush administration, which is governed largely by the technocratic neoconservatives, would develop panoptic machinations like the Patriot Act and the Total Information Awareness Program. It is even less surprising that the ascendancy of these panoptic machinations was facilitated by the so-called War on Terror. Indeed, the war system has proven to be the most advantageous to the power elite. The Total Information Awareness Program was the most prevalent manifestation of this contemporary panoptic age. Daniel Short, a journalist for the Christian Science Monitor, examines this panoptic machine. Deep in the recess of the Pentagon is the Office of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. DARPA is where Vice Admiral John Poindexter, USN retired, hangs out these days working on TIA. TIA stands for Total Information Awareness. The project, which is budgeted at $10 million this year and expected to get more next year, has been getting bad press. This, in part, is because of its Orwellian-sounding purpose is to create a centralized database of personal information about Americans. Cutting-edge technology would be used to gather everything that the computer age has to offer, from travel plans to pharmacy prescriptions. Pentagon officials say it's meant to be a tool in the war against terrorism, not an invasion of privacy of innocent citizens. Well, maybe. But that would sound more reassuring if it were not for the identity of the project manager. Indeed, Poindexter is certainly not one of the most ethical people who have ever lived. His past is replete with scandal and fraud, more than enough to preclude him from such a sensitive position as project manager of a national security program. Shore proceeds to unveil Poindexter's shady past. Admiral Poindexter is probably better known for destroying information than for gathering it. Before a congressional investigating committee in 1986, he admitted that, as President Reagan's national security advisor, he destroyed evidence in connection with the Iran-Contra affair. Specifically, he tore up the only signed copy of a document called a presidential finding that retroactively authorized shipment of arms into Iran in return for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. He testified that he did this to avoid embarrassment for Mr. Reagan. Poindexter, like Oliver North, who reported to him, was convicted on federal district court of lying to Congress and of obstruction. The conviction was overturned on technical grounds by an appeals court majority of 2 Reagan-appointed judges, Douglas Ginsburg and David Santel, over the vigorous dissent of Carter-appointed Judge Abner Mikva. Yet despite Poindexter's dubious past, the Bush administration has no qualms about employing him in such a sensitive post. Shore states, "The Bush administration has shown no inclination to alter Poindexter's sensitive assignment. Mr. Rumsfeld says, I would recommend people take a deep breath. Nothing terrible is going to happen," end quote. What was the nature of Poindexter's Total Information Awareness Project? What was its true magnitude and scope? Washington Times journalist Audrey Hudson provides a glimpse. In what one critic has called a Super Snoop stream, the Defense Department's Total Information Awareness Program would be authorized to collect every type of available public and private data in what the Pentagon describes as one centralized grand database. The data would include email, internet use, travel, credit card purchase, phone and bank records of foreigners. Further elaborating on the ominous scope of this centralized database, New York Times columnist William Safire wrote, quote, "To this computerized dossier on your private life from commercial sources, add every piece of information that government has about you. Passport application, driver's license and bridge toll records, judicial and divorce records, complaints from nosy neighbors to the FBI, your lifetime paper trail plus the latest hidden camera surveillance. And you have the Super Snoop's dream, a total information awareness about every U.S. citizen." And you could multiply this by 100 now in the digital age, and then when they want to do CBDC. The movie The Lives of Others is a good example of this, what they could do back in the 80s. So imagine now if you had the power of the Stasi on everything. The official emblem of the Total Information Awareness Program semiotically gesticulated towards the rise of the panoptic machine. Shore concludes his examination of the program with the following statement. Outside Poindexter's Pentagon office is a logo showing an all-seeing eye on top of a pyramid and the slogan, Scientia est potentia, knowledge is power. It's very Gnostic, from the Illuminists, from Weishaupt, who wanted to put everybody in a machine, and this is influenced by Descartes, who had visions of the world being a machine from false angels, with no religious discernment, no hesychasm. At this juncture, science is power. The question is, how much power over knowledge about us should be entrusted to an admitted destroyer of federal documents, or this demon government? At this juncture, it is most appropriate to recall Hoffman's remarks. The doctrine of man playing God reaches its nadir at the philosophy of scientism, which makes it possible the complete mental, spiritual, and physical enslavement of mankind through technologies such as satellite and computer surveillance. A state of affairs symbolized by the all-seeing eye above the unfinished pyramid on the U.S. $1 bill. The truncated pyramid, capped by the all-seeing eye, is a recurring motif throughout Masonic iconography. Having previously established Masonry's role at the erection of the scientific dictatorships, it comes as little surprise that this symbol should appear again. It semiotically gesticulates towards America's ongoing transformation into a fully functional technocracy. The neoconservative technocrats, who represent the philosophical scions of the Illuminist-bred Jacobins, currently dominate this emergent technocracy. As Pajot says, symbolism happens. Extensive press coverage of the TIA led to the Pentagon shutting the program down and Poindexter leaving the government. However, the TIA's method of collecting vast heaps of information, known in national security circles as data mining, did not disappear. Initiatives that elites cannot establish in plain view, they usually sneak through the back door. And when you hear Tristan Harris and these people who are talking about speech, not reach, to justify censorship for liberalism on Facebook, because QAnon, everything's QAnon adjacent, but I can't call you WEF adjacent, right? I can't call you CIA adjacent for this program Bush had. But you guys can say, oh, good speech doesn't always beat bad speech. Well, maybe not always, but you can still try. And if you allow governments to dictate what gets talked about, we won't have good speech. It's not just about good speech. It's about precise speech and what conversations need to happen and who needs to be talking and who are the best representatives for the various positions. And we actually have people who can do that, and you guys shadow ban us. You shadow ban our guys who are not Nazis. You shadow ban the Eastern Orthodox influencers and the paleo conservatives. Tucker got fired for talking about these things. And then you turn around and paint us as QAnon, who was helped to be made by the CIA to sit here and play this game. So this Tristan Harris garbage, to all the sophistry he runs around doing, getting big push, running around with Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's allowed to talk about MK Ultra, but we aren't, is because we would beat you. It's because you would lose and we're right and you're wrong. Let's keep going. Data mining. The panoptic machine is certainly no exception to this rule. It was recently revealed that in the fall of 2001, President Bush secretly ordered the National Security Agency to sidestep a special court and carry out warrantless spying on American citizens. The legality of the president's actions is questionable. Under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, before spying domestically on Americans suspected of having terrorist ties, the NSA must first go before a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and show probable cause to obtain a warrant. Persuading an FISA court to give the NSA the warrants it desired would have been relatively simple, as James Bamford points out. The court rarely turns the government down. Since it was established in 1978, the court has granted about 19,000 warrants. It has only rejected 5, and in those cases, the government has the right to appeal to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review, which in 27 years has only heard one case. And should the appeals court also reject the warrant request, the government could then appeal immediately to a closed session of the Supreme Court. Given the ease with which the NSA might have procured the requirements, and it is shocking that the president's secret program bypassed the FISA court entirely. Perhaps the evidence suggesting probable cause was extremely flimsy. It would not be the first time that such was the case. J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that Martin Luther King Jr. was a subversive and tirelessly snooped into the famous civil rights leader's private life. Today it is known that, while King's private life left much to be desired, the case that he was somehow a conscious agent of Moscow was weak. Perhaps Bush did not want to take a chance no matter how low the odds, because his oligarchical upbringing made it hard for him to take no for an answer. And I want to give a little context here because we're reading this looking back. The Bush administration practically got the Obama administration elected. You could see that the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton are basically given and Biden are basically given a pass to be neocons. They're completely protected by the media to do this. Nobody even questions them, but it's the right, that's the warmongers. And you can see the Dan Crenshaws and the Nikki Haley's trying to fulfill that role, and the Rhinos and Lindsey Grahams and the John McCains. doing this, but the left is doing it too. So they got a game here that fragments the anti-war right. On top of that, you see Obama put in laws to propagandize, making it legal to propagandize the American public, and really leapfrogged off the Freedom of Information Acts that Bush had put into place, and is still using this war on terror. This is why these conservatives who want to back Nikki Haley passing speech laws against anti-Zionism are stupid. It's going to lead to digital non-sedition acts. If you can imagine the non-sedition acts they had in the Civil War and World War I that shut people down and blackballed people and depersoned people, the abilities they could have with that now, and you think the left isn't going to come in because everybody's going to see what a tough, patriotic warmonger you are, and we're all going to go become Dan Crenshaw and go over into the Middle East and beat everybody and police the entire world, then everything's going to be Republican? You're stupid. It's not going to happen. Reading continues. However, there is another possibility. Perhaps the neoconservative faction of the elite are determined to establish the panoptic machine before this president's time in office is over. Such a task would call for circumventing every safeguard the law provides. The president may believe he has done just that by having the NSA spy on hundreds, perhaps even thousands of Americans for just a few days or weeks at a time. Such fishing expeditions would allow the president to argue that eavesdropping was short-term and that FISA does not apply because it is for long-term monitoring. Even still, Bamford contends that such a method is precisely the type of abuse the FISA court was put in place to stop. The president may be establishing a dangerous precedent, the ends of which is a fully functional panoptic machine. How was the NSA able to conduct a spy campaign on hundreds, if not thousands, of American citizens? Investigative journalist Jason Leopold answers that question. Quote, a clandestine national security agency spy program, codenamed Echelon, was likely responsible for tapping into the emails, telephone calls, and facsimiles of thousands of average American citizens over the past 4 years in its effort to identify people suspected of communicating with al-Qaeda terrorists, according to half a dozen current and former intelligence officials from the NSA and FBI. Echelon is a network of listening posts scattered across the world. The capabilities of this network are nothing less than shocking. The BBC's Andrew Bamford elaborates. Every international telephone call, fax, email, or radio transmission can be listened to by powerful computers capable of voice recognition. They home in on a long list of keywords, or patterns of messages. Technology such as that employed by the Echelon network is making it possible for the rising technocratic system of government to become what the author Charles Stross calls a panopticon singularity. Stross even refers to the Echelon as one of the 10 technologies contributing to the creation of the panopticon singularity. The panopticon singularity is nothing less than a carceral state made absolute in its power by technology, Stross elaborates. A panopticon singularity is the logical outcome of the burgeoning technologies of the singularity are funneled into automating law enforcement. Previous police states were limited by manpower, but the panopticon singularity substitutes technology and ultimately replaces human consciousness with a brilliant, merciless prosthesis. If a panopticon singularity emerges, you'd be well advised to stay away from Massachusetts if you and your partner aren't married. Don't think about smoking a joint unless you want to see the inside of your labor camps, where over 50% of the population sooner or later go. Don't jaywalk, chew gum in public, smoke, exceed the speed limit, stand in front of fire exit routes, or wear clothing that violates the city dress code. You won't be able to watch those old DVDs of Friends you copied during the naughty oddies because if you stick them in your player, it'll call the copyright police on you. You'd better not spend too much time at the bar or your insurance premiums will rocket and your boss might ask you to undergo therapy. You might be able to read a library book or play a round of a computer game, but your computer will be counting the words you read and monitoring your pulse so that it can bill you for the excitement it has delivered. Now, if you look here, too, at the stuff they're advocating at the World Economic Forum, where they can use Amazon books to watch everything you do and watch your emotions when you read to know you better, and then do this with a chip inside of you, this is insane. And it's probably not going to be this morality this person is worried about. It's probably going to be the enforcement of a Huxleyan morality, and they'll probably persecute norms and tradition. Those who believe that snooping technology will not be used to erect a panopticon singularity and will only be employed against terrorists are being extremely naive. Echelon has already been used for purposes outside of fighting terrorism. These purposes were criminal in nature. Andrew Bamford reports, Journalist Duncan Campbell has spent much of his life investigating Echelon. In a report commissioned by the European Parliament, he produced evidence that the NSA snooped on the phone calls from a French firm bidding for a contract in Brazil. They passed the information on to an American competitor who won the contract. If the powers that be would use Echelon to give American companies an unfair advantage, they would most certainly use it to silence opposition of the rising global scientific dictatorship as well. It is interesting to examine the new definition of peace presented in the Iron Mountain report. It reads, "The word peace, as we have used it in the following pages, implies total and general disarmament. Under such conditions, resistance against tyranny is virtually non-existent. With the exception of combatants whose behavior will be closely monitored by their superiors in the military and whose dominant concern shall be survival on the battlefields of the elite's perpetual war, no one else shall have the weapons with which they would resist tyranny. Indeed, war is peace. The peace afforded for the New World Order at the expense of others shall mean perpetual war for the rest of humanity. Eurasia has always been at war with Oceania." The report from Iron Mountain has also acknowledged the role of science fiction literature in the psychological conditioning of the masses. Up till now, this has been suggested only in fiction, notably in the works of Wells, Huxley, Orwell, and others engaged in the imaginative anticipation of the sociology of the future. But fantasies projected in Brave New World in 1984 seemed less and less implausible over the years since their publication. And we definitely have to caveat this with the fact that H.G. Wells was part of an actual open totalitarian and Fabian socialist conspiracy for transhumanism. Huxley knew these people too. He named the elites in his book after those kinds of people. Lenina Rothschild, the first one was a crazy feminist, blended in Fabian synthesis with the Rothschilds. Ford's and Rockefeller names are there. Bernard Shaw, Karl Marx, main character. He actually had we already talked about how he had his address, his Berkeley speech. He actually talks about this as a real plan and a good thing. The traditional association of slavery with ancient pre-industrial cultures should not blind us to its adaptability to advanced forms of social organization. The report's mention of Wells is most appropriate, especially within the context of the war system. The shape of things to come provided numerous semiotic intimations of the Second World War. Orwell's 1984 is also significant. In this literary classic, Orwell presented a world order where the chief elements of societal stability was war. The machine, which represented a nation's technical industrial infrastructure, had been transmogrified into a strategic weapon against its own population. Shamefully wasteful governmental programs were enacted to keep the citizenry perpetually impoverished. This Hobbesian war of all against all was perpetuated by a small elite for the purposes of maintaining their power. That which the report euphemistically calls imaginative anticipation of the sociology of the future qualifies as sci-fi predictive programming. With such literary works are narrative paradigms that are politically and socially expedient to the power elite. Thus, when the future unfolds as planned, it assumes the paradigmatic character of the fiction that foretold it. And if we look at this use of sci-fi and when sci-fi comes in, it comes in with spiritism as a replacement for occultism mixed with science. It's very alchemical. And if you look through science fiction, there's always Dune. Dune has a new kind of blending between Catholicism, processed theology, and Sufic Islam for a kind of warrior religion where you get, occult powers and stuff like this. It's almost the Star Wars, the Force. There's this Heraclean force is what God is reduced to, and you can tap into the good side or the dark side. It's a Manichaean dialectic. So if you look into what's actually in sci-fi, there's a lot of dispensationalism, hope for a new world. If you look at the remake of Foundation and what undergirded it, it's very Jungian. It's very Joseph Campbell. It reverts to these pagan theologies. You're seeing the Marvel universe breaking out into kind of metaphysics of Hindu metaphysics, Masonic metaphysics, Doctor Strange and the multiverse. This is why it matches up with postmodernism. And this is what somebody like Peterson misses, is the theological and metaphysical presuppositions are part of why all this shit is turning into postmodernism. And Father Seraphim Rose talks about this in Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. Here's a good section on UFOs that opens up with the history of science fiction being a chiliastic religion and being so tied to this stuff. And you see it becoming a kind of religion. You're seeing now that we have to accept the errors that modernity made and rebuild religion on it. The Peterson phenomena is rebuilding religion off Disney cartoons and Carl Jung and science fiction. And people are loving that. You're seeing people that are more concerned with defending their comic books in the Paul Vanderklay sphere than they are with actual truth or with God. Doesn't mean you can't read a comic book or you're a bad person, but to give it the level of spirituality these people want to do, or Paul Anleiter and all these people want to do metamodernism. The metamodernism movement is garbage. And it's even people that are in that movement, in the Vervaeke sphere, rejected it because it's garbage and it falls apart on its suppositions. But now you're seeing all these Protestants taking it up because they need something to justify their religion. They need semiotics and phenomenology because they don't have the Hesychast connection, which they reject. You're seeing this now with this blending between Islam and the West and this whole Lucas Gage movement. You see it with Andrew Tate making his comic books and stuff with this kind of Eastern occultism in it. We're going to continue here. The semiotics of sci-fi predictive programming. The media circus surrounding 9/11 and the science fiction films that preceded it provide an excellent case study in semiotic warfare. The entertainment industry of the September 11th world, pre-September 11th world, was instrumental in creating a cultural milieu that was already predisposed to war. Few are not acquainted with the scene in Independence Day during which the White House is destroyed by a powerful energy beam from a hovering alien ship. In his semiotic analysis of the famous clip, Professor Elliot Gaines discerns the narrative qualities that embody the paradigmatic character of the situation and images surrounding 9/11. The researcher would contend that such synchronicities were consciously engineered by the entertainment industrial complex. You know, there was another one, too, where Iron Man is fighting the Mandarin in one of those DC cartoons I think they had on Cartoon Network. And the Mandarin was actually blowing up the Twin Towers with 2 missiles. And this is several years before 9/11. Intrinsic to the narrative characteristics of Independence Day was a paradigmatic template that the elite successfully imposed upon September 11th. Promulgated vigorously by the establishment media organs, Independence Day was instrumental in creating a cultural milieu that would be hospitable to future media manipulations. By the time of the WTC attacks, World Trade Center, the collective subconscious of America was fertile with memes planted by Independence Day. The mimetic fertility is most effectively illustrated by the comments of MSNBC reporter Ron Insana. Insana witnessed the disintegration of the World Trade Center firsthand. In an interview with Matt Lauer, Katie Couric, and Tom Brokaw, Insana vividly recounted his experience. Quote, "As we are going across the street, we were not terribly far from the World Trade Center building, the South Tower. As we were cutting across a quarantine zone, actually, the building began disintegrating. We heard it and looked up and started to see elements of the building come down, and we ran. And honestly, it was like a scene out of Independence Day. Everything began to rain down. It was pitch black around us in the wind, and the wind was ripping through the corridors of lower Manhattan." End quote. Gaines identifies the Independence Day reference as semiotically significant, given his distinction as a journalist before a global audience. Insana, thoroughly cognizant of the fact of his intertextual reference to the film, will be understood as a commonly known cultural text. End quote. At this point, the previously dormant seeds of virulent thought implanted by Independence Day has been activated. Insana's invocation of the commonly known text has triggered the release of ideational spores within humanity's collective consciousness. Gaines reveals the semiotic effect of Insana's intertextual reference upon the participant's mind. The violence in Independence Day coded as fiction constructs a narrative binary opposition that clearly identifies good against evil. The available images representing the events of September 11th, using inference drawn from Independence Day's sign-object relations, construct a narrative paradigm based upon the same themes, but coded as reality. And you can take this back to the War on the Worlds was used, and the hysteria it caused. And the government actually did studies on that. It's a big psyop. And how many other movies have we seen this? There's ones where the world freezes, and then there's ones with giant tidal waves, and then there's ones with asteroids hitting. We're bombarded by this, and we're all geared to accept the solutions they have for the problems they tell us about. Indeed, Insana's intertextual reference helped establish the paradigm of good against evil, upon which the war on terrorism would be premised. Suddenly, Arabs became analogous to the alien invaders of Independence Day. Simultaneously, the United States became analogous to the beleaguered homeworld. Semiotically, Insana's intertextual reference prompted America's collective subconscious to reconceptualize the relational dynamic between the West and the Arab world. Good humans against evil aliens. A narrative paradigm coded as fiction in Independence Day suddenly recoded itself in the guise of reality. However, according to the elite's narrative paradigm for September 11th, being neither good nor human is part of the Arab's role. It is not this researcher's contention that Insana consciously designed his intertextual reference to achieve such an end. However, it is the researcher's contention that Insana's intertextual reference is a product of a larger semiotic deception. The larger semiotic deception is part of a program for cultural subversion known as sci-fi predictive programming, a term coined by researcher Michael Hoffman. Elaborating on this concept, Hoffman states predictive programming works by means of the propagation of the illusion of an infallibly accurate vision of how the world is going to look in the future. End quote. Innocuous though the genre may seem, science fiction literature had a history of presenting narrative paradigms that are oddly consistent with the plans of the elite. In Dope Inc., associates of political dissident Lyndon LaRoche claimed the famous literary works of H.G. Wells and his apprentices, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, were really mass appeal, organizing documents on behalf of one world order. Such would seem to be the case with Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, which presents a socialist totalitarian world government under the appellation of the Federation. Moreover, Roddenberry espoused a core precept of the ruling class religion. Quote, "As nearly as I can concentrate on the question today, I believe I am God. Certainly you are. I think we intelligent beings on this planet are all a piece of God, are becoming God." End quote. This monism, this panpsychism. The statement echoes the occult doctrine of becoming, a belief promoted within the Masonic Lodge and disseminated on the popular level as Darwinism. According to this doctrine, man is gradually evolving towards apotheosis. In 2001, A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke presented a semiotic signpost for the next step in this chimerical evolutionary ascent. Michael Hoffman explains, quote, 2001, A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick, and based on the writings of Arthur C. Clarke, is, with hindsight, a pompous, pretentious exercise. But when it debuted, it sent shivers up the collective spine. It was a hallowed place in the cryptosphere because it has a hallowed space in the cryptosphere because it helped fashion what the Videodrome embodies today. At the heart of the film is the worship of the Darwinian hypothesis of evolution and the positioning of a mysterious monolith as the evolutionary battery or sentinel that transforms the ape into the spaceman, hence the Odyssey. Clarke and Kubrick's movie, 2001, opens with a scene of the dawn of man, supposedly intended to take the viewer back to the origins of humanity on Earth. This lengthy sequence is vintage Darwinism, portraying our genesis as bestial and featuring man-like apes as our ancestors. In the film, the evolution of these hominids is raised to the next rung on the evolutionary ladder by the sudden appearance of a mysterious monolith. Commensurate with the new presence of this enigmatic sentinel, our alleged simian progenitors learned to acquire a primitive form of technology. For the first time, they use a bone as a weapon. This bone is then tossed into the air by one of the ape men. Kubrick photographs the bone in slow motion, and by means of special effects, he shows it becoming an orbiting spacecraft, thus traversing millions of years in evolutionary time. The next evolutionary level occurs in 2001, the 21st century. In the year 2001, the cosmic sentinel that is the monolith reappears again, triggering an alert that man is on the next step in his glorious evolution. Like the tabula rasa of human consciousness, the barren canvas of the monolith awaits the next brushstrokes of unseen painters. A new portrait of man is scheduled to be painted, and the glorious evolution of humanity continues. Coincidentally, this semiotic signpost reappeared before the public eye in the actual year 2001. The reappearance is recounted in a BBC News article entitled Mysterious Monolith Marks 2001. A black steel monolith nearly 3 meters high has mysteriously appeared in a park in the American city of Seattle. The unmarked sculpture, planted on a grassy knoll in Magnuson Park, seems to have been put in place on New Year's Eve. It is believed to be a reference to the black monolith featured in the classic science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey, a collaboration between director Stanley Kubrick and writer Arthur C. Clarke. As in the film, the appearance of the black structure raises questions. The most obvious one, who is its creator? End quote. Before this question could be answered, the monolith vanished. A follow-up on BBC article elaborates. Just as mysteriously as it appeared, the monolith, which was found on a grassy knoll in Seattle's Magnuson Park on New Year's morning, has vanished into thin air. Baffled park officials discovered the absence of it on Wednesday when they went to check whether the structure was a danger to public safety. All that remained of the 9-foot-tall, smooth steel block was a rectangular hole where it had stood, a few candles, and a broken-stemmed rose. The black sculpture has confounded locals who found it. Devoid of markings or inscriptions, it was presumed to be a reference to the monoliths featured in the classic science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Although only a fleeting attraction, the monolith had already become a popular draw for the park, with visitors flocking to see and touch it. And they have a similar black stone in Mecca. They have a similar black stone for the Sufis that had the same kind of belief as these elites at the UN, to the unknown God. They try to reduce God to what they want it to be, so man can take his place. The same year, the World Trade Center attacks took place, and the Bush administration began to erect a garrison state under the auspices of national security. The chronologically recapitulated theme of the exchanging the freedom for security is one of the most prevalent symptoms of this transformational period. However, semiotic intimations of this emergent garrison state may be discernible in the 1997 film Starship Troopers. Based on the sci-fi novel by Robert Heinlein, the film presents a socialist totalitarian world government that owes its very existence to a threat from beyond. Synopsizing the theme of the film, literary critic Geoffrey Whitehall makes an interesting observation. Quote, "Against, yet within, its cliched ontological galaxy, Starship Troopers mobilizes the beyond to critique this dominant us-them narrative. Seeking salvation, and the emergence of modernity, seeking security as the dominant trope of political life in the sovereign state." John Vervaeke also holds this kind of position, and I can easily argue with this, and I'm going to right now, because St. John Chrysostom talks about, "Oh, death, where is thy sting?" They didn't just try to terrify everybody. This is something that's in all societies that use fear as a tool, but there is a legitimate fear of damnation. And we can see we're also told not to fear death and to have an ultimate type of courage that transcends even that of the Stoics. So I'm going to keep reading this guy's quote. "The church relied on the discourse of fear to establish its authority, discipline its followers, and ward off its enemies. In effect, creating Christian world politics. Under modern world politics, similarly, the sovereign state relies on the creation of an external threat to author its foreign policy and establish the lofty category of citizenship as the only form of modern human qualification," end quote. So I do think there is something here with the materialist world where we get rid of the eternal evils that we are supposed to be worried about, the eternal goods we're supposed to strive for them and gain positive acquisition of the spirit in combating, and live within the ethical and perennial covenant and virtues that have been commanded to us that navigate any time period in changing reality for humans. So when we get to this evolutionary materialism, it's inevitable that they still have to find a threat, but they have to actually externalize the threat. So that's a legitimate critique right here. It is interesting to note that the very same year Starship Troopers released, former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski published The Grand Chessboard. In this overtly imperialistic tract, Brzezinski delineated the geostrategy by which America would attain global primacy. According to Brzezinski, the period of American hegemony would represent little more than a transitional period preceding her amalgamation into a one-world government. This is the shit Bush says, New World Order. These conservatives that talk about the globalists, half of them are globalists too. And one of the most, whether they know it or not, and one of the most damning portions of the text, Brzezinski reveals the catalyst for America's imperialist mobilization. Quote, moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. A truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat did appear. His name was Osama bin Laden. Starship Troopers was premised upon the same thesis that would underpin American foreign policy 4 years later. And by the way, Starship Troopers, the movie's kind of it's kind of a fun movie, and they kind of dumb it down. But the original one, the original book by Heinlein, is actually like much more of a philosophical book about running a kind of Platonic world warrior society, a caste system, in which the only citizens are those who are soldiers, and it's about the survival of the human race against the aliens and the extraterrestrial imperative and a unifying threat. So it's made there very philosophically in a very totalitarian and Platonic manner. Now, his name was Osama bin Laden. Starship Troopers was premised upon the same thesis that would underpin American foreign policy 4 years later. Consensus facilitated by an external threat. Like Ensana's Independence Day analogy, the thematic similarities between Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard and Heinlein's Starship Troopers reiterate the semiotic concept of intertextuality. The various texts comprising human discourse are not read in a cultural vacuum. On the level of consumption, any one text is necessarily read in relationship to others, and a range of textual knowledge is brought to bear upon it. Likewise, a range of textual knowledges was brought to bear upon September 11th. Like Independence Day, Heinlein's Starship Troopers constituted part of this body of textual knowledge. The centrality of an external threat to the formulation of foreign policy, which thematically underpinned Brzezinski's geostrategy, was semiotically communicated to the public through Starship Troopers. In the elite's narrative paradigm for September 11th, the necessity of external threat was illustrated by the nationalistic fervor that followed with the World Trade Center attacks. Suddenly, the appellation of patriot, which was previously a stigma assigned to tax protesters and members of militias, regained its place in the cultural lexicon of reverential labels. The removal of the pejorative connotations previously imposed upon the patriot facilitated the semiotic deception that was to follow with the introduction of the Patriot Act. Connotatively, this very title of Patriot Act suggested that those who opposed it constituted unpatriotic elements. Thus, acquiescence meant patriotism. This inference echoes the mantra presented in Starship Troopers: service guarantees citizenship. In the post-9/11 cultural milieu, where the term patriot was as elastic as the term terrorist, independent reasoning was subverted by a burgeoning epidemic of cognitive dissonance. Starship Troopers also reiterated the narrative paradigm of good humans against evil aliens, a belief integral to the imperial mobilization of Brzezinski's geostrategy. The forces of good, embodied by America, were mobilized against the forces of evil, embodied by the Arab world. In keeping with the narrative paradigm of the elite, the media continued its standard practice of typecasting. Like the extraterrestrial bugs of Starship Troopers, Arabs were cast as hostile aliens. Meanwhile, Americans maintained the role as humans. Again, it is not this researcher's contention that Ron Ensana was a conscious agent of this semiotic deception. Yet, as a part of the establishment media, Ensana acted as the perfect transmission belt for memes emanating from the ruling class itself. As the old adage goes, no one knows who invented the water, but you can bet it wasn't the fish. Immersed within the sea of establishment-controlled media, Ensana could not identify the larger semiotic manipulation in which he unwittingly played an integral role. Science fiction has been called the literature of ideas. Ensana's intertextual reference suggests that he had contracted an ideational contagion through exposure to sci-fi films like Independence Day and Starship Troopers. And we talked earlier about how Hollywood pushed all these woke ideas for a very long time, and we even pushed Martin Luther King stuff and critical race theory ideas over into France that didn't even belong there. We've seen neocons like Douglas Murray make a legitimate critique of why the hell is England going crazy about the Confederate flag and American slavery. It's because of this Hollywood stuff, being used as a psyop to target the populace and push things. Right now, we just had a movie about, babies being born outside the womb, and like a surrogate robotic womb that the man and the woman carry together as corporate cogs in the machine, and now there's no difference between man and woman. We've seen all this woke shit. We've seen this stuff go over there, but these people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to admit they're a part of the problem. Andrew Tate has picked up these semiotics with the Matrix, which reverts, theosis and coming awake to what's going on as a continual process to something you become awake once to, and now you're against the system. But you justify yourself using a Gnostic idea of God to be whatever gets you what you want, to get you your Bugatti. I've got to get a Bugatti. And then what's his response to these globalists, right? His response to these globalists and transhumanists is, the only way you're going to survive is if you've got a lot of money. It's the only way to stop these people. It's not to come together. It's not to reinstate tradition. It's to make sure he gets to keep being somebody and making a lot of money, bullshitting you on how you're going to make a ton of money. And what this means is the only way you'll succeed if you take this route is to join in with these transhumanists and technocrats and do what they say and become influential through their ethos. And then you can have money. Then you can take the mark and be somebody. And these semiotic ideas also follow the kind of archetypal patterns in the human mind, and they follow history, what's been going on in history and what we've been brainwashed into thinking, what's pushed in the schools and what you were told, what's on the news in the allowable Overton window. You see Piers Morgan going on right now with Ben Shapiro setting the Overton window the same way Noam Chomsky did with William F. Buckley. So all this stuff is reinforced. There's massive reinforcement. It's reinforced by the world you work in. It's reinforced by all the other media you take in. It's reinforced by what's shadow banned and kept from being talked about. And a lot of these people who are supposedly shadow banned, that have such reach, I think they play a duplicitous game where they ban them in certain ways and then they pump them up and make them controversial in other ways so that they can point to those actual Nazis, to your actual Nick Fuentes and whatever, and say, oh, we got to stop these people from talking about this. The government pushed QAnon, and now they call it all Q adjacent. And they use this stuff as the excuse to actually shadow ban people who have something to say. You mean to tell me Lucas Gage can reach the people he did in the amount of time he did, but meanwhile David Patrick Harry and Jay Dyer get shadow banned for talking about transhumanism and the World Economic Forum and the stuff that's right here? I think it's quite obvious. It's very obvious. It's very obvious how protected these people are. And Jordan Peterson's another one, too, that won't talk to these people because he knows who they are through Jonathan Pajot, and he knows what the actual arguments are. He's talked about it before, and he plays the same game and sides with these neocon scum. Ferdinand de Saussure observed that normally we do not express ourselves by using single linguistic signs, but groups of signs organized in complexes, which themselves are signs. Indeed, isolated signs say very little, if anything at all. Communication and cogent thought are contingent upon the coalescence of signs. Such coalescence constitutes the complex social interchange called discourse. Likewise, the semiotic significance of a particular scene becomes evident only once the precipitant has correlated the constituent signs composing it. This is the way this shit's written. This is syntagmatic analysis, and I'm not making fun of it. It's actually a very good analysis. It's just when you start talking about these things in depth. This syntagmatic analysis, the study of a text structures and correlating signs, because they are narratives, films largely depend upon sequential configuration that produce the illusion of causal relationships. Likewise, the narrative paradigms that the power elite wished to impose upon September 11th was sequenced to create a false causal connection between the World Trade Center attacks and the Arab world. During the interview with Insana, Korik abruptly announced an upsetting wire that just came across the wire from the West Bank. Korik proceeds to paint a disturbing portrait of militant Muslims celebrating the destruction of the Twin Towers. But you'll notice the news media didn't talk about the Jewish people that were celebrating. Quote, thousands of Palestinians celebrated Tuesday's terror attacks as the United Nations chanting God is great and distributing candy to passersby, even as their leader, Yasser Arafat, said he was horrified. Thus, the U.S. government has become increasingly unpopular in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the past year of Israeli-Palestinian fighting. And you see Netanyahu, when we were going over there for the WMDs. Netanyahu has said he was glad about 9/11, and when he was talking about WMD in Iraq, we got into how he played a role in that in the previous chapter, but Netanyahu actually held up all these CDs as though they were evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and then he held up a chart. You want to talk about semiotics? He held up a chart of a bomb. It was like a cartoon bomb with lines in the chart, and somehow this explained why there was WMDs. As the report continued, Korik read the same upsetting wire again, this time as a voiceover narrative to video footage of Palestinian demonstrators. The footage was accompanied by a title card claiming that the event had occurred earlier this morning. This researcher contends that the juxtaposition of this image with Insana's intertextual reference was intentional. It was designed to reinforce the paradigmatic template of good Americans against evil Arabs. Within the mind of the recipient, causal connections were already being made. Behold the face of the enemy. This subconscious declared, the syntagmatic structure of the NBC report was designed to achieve precisely this effect. And these people study this. They've studied this shit since Edward Bernays. They know what they're doing. They have the Tavistock Institute. Jordan Peterson goes off about, the transgenderism. It's a Tavistock NES that was under lawsuit for pushing all these gender surgeries and pushing the gender social contagion. They pushed it the same way they pushed this militarism that they've been given this platform for. They created they didn't create it, but they weaponized and turned it into a psychological tool with the term isolationist, right? This is Tavistock. This is your news media. This is the people that study your psychology to advertise you and advertise to you and have even put chairs in grade schools with Pepsi slogans on them and stuff like this. I mean, come on now. And nobody wants to talk about this. You see that the conservatives that are concerned with big government all of a sudden shut up because they want to uphold capitalism good stops communism. We're going to stop the communism with our neoconservatism, even though we don't know it was started by communists. It's fucking stupid, and I'm sick of this shit. As the report continues, all right, let's see. Within the mind of the percipient, causal connections were already being made. Behold the face of the enemy, the subconscious declared. The syntagmatic structure of the NBC report was designed to achieve precisely the effect. Upon closer examination, the semiotic deception grows even more sinister. Gaines elaborates on the unfolding sham. NBC later acknowledged that it had committed a breach of ethics by using archive footage with an unverified wire report. Only through convention do we assume the indexual nature of an image grounded by the text of the news. The image was not actually acquired September 11th as an authentic Palestinian celebration of the attack against the U.S. The image was selected from an archive as a global sign to imply Islamic extremism as the enemy, end quote. So it's even fake footage. And do you remember when people started talking about what they wanted to talk about on the internet? They put out all those little statements from local news stations and the big news. Fox News, CBS, everybody. For the Sinclair Group. Democracy is under attack. Other people have other narratives than the ones we want to make up and tell you to abide by, to control you. Obey. Democracy is under attack. Democracy with dangerous narratives. These people are so fucking full of shit. They're full of shit. Was this an accident or a consciously engineered psychocognitive result? Given the distinct possibility of a conspiracy to orchestrate 9/11, one cannot help but wonder if the NBC report was designed to distract attention. Gaines states, quote, the stereotypical images of Arab, Mideastern-looking people celebrating on a street could be falsely anchored to a specific people from a designed time and place. With the eyes of the world firmly fixed upon Islamic extremism, the enemy, the true criminals, remained hidden behind a semiotic veil. End quote. And I do want to add one point. We do have these problems of Islam that as Orthodox we would criticize. Sam Shamoun would criticize them. I've talked about who you can go to, Orthodox Shahada. I mean, there is Islamic terror. There is a call for jihad. Even when Jordan started talking about the inner and the outer jihad, that implies there's still an outer jihad. And that is the traditional Islamic way of doing things. And even though we've involved ourselves in these people's business, we can't totally just make something come out of nowhere. One of the reasons this is such a powerful propaganda tool to get us into the militarism and the war is because there is actual Islamic terror. It's part of the reason we were able to ally ourselves with these terrorist squads and use them for our own good and train and fund them, because there was a desire to act them out. Even if they would ally with us temporarily, They would hope that we would weaken ourselves over time and keep taking us into our countries and conquer with Islamism. They're serious people, and they also want to kill people. So you actually have a real referent in real life that's been multiplied and exaggerated, and we've made it into something bigger than it is too, through our own guilt and involvement with them. This is a point I made when we were talking about atheism, when they talk about all the crimes of religion, but we look at all the crimes of communism that far outweigh religion. We also see this fake traditionalism in modernity and these advanced technical states moving towards scientific dictatorship that have infiltrated religions and have funded and chosen to work with specific types of religion and heresies and funded Islamic terror while funding Zionism, while pushing the apocalyptic neocon dispensationalist evangelicals, the infiltration of the Vatican, the infiltration that they're doing in Ukraine right now into religion is part of the reason for the war. So now we have this thing too where you could even say there's complicity between religion and the atheist and technical state and these Fabians and these Satanists and these Gnostics and just the system itself. It's a little more complicated. And if you were to add that responsibility to the secular world, this argument that the only reason anybody's killing each other is over religion and these stupid people that think they could wipe it out, or Lucas Gage even saying the only problem is Zionism by itself, Muslims and Christians will unite, get rid of the Zionists, and the whole world's going to live in world peace. This is a stupid fucking take. It's really low tier and childish, basic bitch ideas. And if he wants to ally with Christians who think that Zionists are a synagogue of Satan, well, our battle is with principalities, and that those principalities affect other views. This is a satanic worldview. It's not just the World Economic Forum. Of course, there's Jewish people that fund that, but there's other people that fund it, but it's a technocratic city of man egregore that's somewhat running on its own, too. So this idea that all you're going to do is go get rid of the Jews and then you won't be involved in technical states and these types of ideas that have permeated us, or that your ideas such as Islam won't be wrong because they deviated from revelation, is stupid. It's dumb. It's like sharing the meme together where they got like Action Jackson and Arnold Schwarzenegger shaking hands in Predator where they're flexing their muscles. And they're like, brother, once you and me realize that they're abusing us, we'll come together with my opinion to do what I want, is what these people always mean. And then everything's going to be perfect and nothing will stop us. It's really stupid. Citing Richard L. Lanigan, Gaines asserts fiction and nonfiction are both mediated popular text, the convergence of human experience expressed through technology. That the chief means of deception is technological in nature is intentional. The word technology is derived from the Greek word techne, which means craft. Moreover, the term craft is also associated with witchcraft or Wicca. From the term Wicca, one derives the word wicker. Examining this word a little closer, researcher Michael Hoffman explains, the word wicker has many denotations and connotations, one of which is to bend, as in the bending of reality. This is especially interesting when considering the words of Mark Pesce, co-inventor of virtual reality modeling language. Pesce writes, the enduring archetype of techne within the pre-modern era is magic, of an environment that conforms entirely to the will of being. Through the magic of electronic media, the post-September 11th attacks seemed to conform entirely to the will of the elite. The Druid magicians of antiquity used to carry wands, which were made out of Hollywood. Does this sound familiar? The famous Hollywood sign is but an enormous semiotic marker for an industry that specializes in illusion. Independence Day could be considered just one more of its spells. Given the public compliance to the illusion of the so-called war on terrorism, it would seem that the spell is working, through the alchemical sorcery of electronic media. America's consciousness remained immersed within the semiotic mirage of the post-9/11 culture. War on terrorism, preemptive war in disguise. Well, I'm going to bump ahead here, but there's a good section if you were interested in the previous chapter we have up here on the false flags and everything that got us into 9/11. The mentality here of preemptive war is pretty interesting. It's a good chapter. If you're interested in understanding neoconservatism, I would really recommend this book. I'm going to skip ahead here to a short section. The altar of warfare. As long as there is a socio-political Darwinian elite dominating the affairs of men, humanity can expect to experience a state of perpetual warfare. In The Power Elite, sociologist C. Wright Mills informs readers that the power elite, quote, direct the military establishment, end quote. This means the blue bloods are able to make sure the key positions within the military establishment are always occupied by Darwinian militarists. Darwinian militarists will almost always choose war over diplomacy. Richard Weikart elaborates, Darwinian militarists claim that the universal biological laws decreed the inevitability of war. Humans could not, any more than any other animal, opt out of the struggle for existence, since, as Darwin had explained based on the reading of the Malthus population, expands faster than the food supply. War was thus a natural and necessary element of human competition that selects the most fit and leads to biological adaptation, or most preferred to think to progress. Not only Germans, but many Anglo-American social Darwinists justified war as a natural and inevitable part of the universal struggle for existence. The famous American sociologist William Graham Sumner, one of the most influential social Darwinists in the late 19th century, conceded, "It is the Darwinian competition for life which makes war, and this is why war has always existed and always will." And you can contrast this to the Eastern Orthodox view that the reason war exists is because man fell from the garden and man sinned, but that's not something that requires God to do anything. That was free will and our choice, and we have a way out of that if we would actually follow God and stop waging these wars, and everyone would convert. If not, and we choose falsehood and continue to keep doing what we're doing, then we'll get what's coming to us. There was no promise to end wars. These people are utopians saying they would end war, but then they do it through perpetual war. They want to solve the problem by creating more of the problem. It's so contradictory, it's absurd. And these neocons are part of the same people that are causing the wars right now on the left, that claim they're going to make world peace for us, that would unleash a virus on everybody to make world peace. How are you going to make peace when you can't make peace right now to the best of your ability in a fallen and constrained world? I wonder what kind of world you people are going to make for us. Why should we grant you anything that it would be good if you're doing it through evil? You're demons. Such an outlook holds tremendous ramifications for human society, Weikart explains. By claiming that war is biologically determined, Darwinian militarists denied the moral considerations could be applied to war. In their view, denied that moral considerations could be applied to war. In their view, wars were not caused by free human choices, but by biological processes. So again, it's deterministic, and there's nothing we can do except, accelerate it to transcend out of it. I told you, even libertarian people like the Koch brothers had views like this, and they distorted them into a perverted and syncretic Christian heresy. Blaming persons or nations for waging war is thus senseless, since they are merely blindly following natural laws. Further opposition to war and militarism is futile, according to Darwinian militarists, who regularly scoffed at peace activists for simply not understanding scientific principles.